Good morning, everybody. We are glad to see you all back for day two of our Dissemination and Implementation Science for Researchers workshop. This says day one. Hang on a second. Is this really day one? No, it's day two, but that's okay. I'm going to go to the next screen. So I saw you all yesterday. I'm Tina Studts. I'm one of the implementation science faculty in the Accords DNI Science Core here at the University of Colorado in the School of Medicine. And we are joined by many of the faculty who you saw yesterday. I'm just going to reorient us to today and then kick us off with our first session because just like yesterday, we have tons of content that we want to give you as we are giving you this kind of broad overview to DNI science. So again, today's sessions will all be on Zoom using the same link, and captions are available. If you need them, you can activate them on your end. And in general, please just stay muted to reduce background noise unless you're invited to unmute. And during participation times, it's great if you want to have your camera on. We love being able to see people because it makes it feel like we're more like not talking to a void. So it's lovely to see people's faces. I can see some of you already on. You can raise your hand and lower your hand if you want to, but like yesterday, we're gonna try to go through each session's material, and then if we do have time at the end of a session, we will do a little bit of Q&A like we did yesterday. You are free to use the chat to ask questions. And as a reminder, we're trying not to answer them live in the chat because it is really distracting when people are trying to focus on the presentations, but feel like there's important information going on in the chat as well. So we won't answer in the chat live, but we will be answering in the chat during the break and at lunch. And then potentially, if we have enough questions, we will send out, Jordan will include sort of a Q&A document with answers to things that didn't make it into the chat. Let's see. We're going to continue to present this material from our Intro to DNI Research in Health graduate course, which is part of our certificate program. We will be going from 9 o'clock until 12:45 today, and then there'll be a break, a lunch break, and then those of you who are registered for the small group intensives will come back at 1:15 to meet in your small groups again. And Jordan will make sure that you have access to all the slides as well as resources that are curated by each session presenter. So some of those are already listed in the workbook that hopefully you saw yesterday. And I want to remind you that at the end of that workbook are the templates for the implementation research logic model. So if you were in the small groups, we used those yesterday. And I think it was helpful for people to be thinking about like determinants and context, what kind of implementation outcomes they're thinking about, what their thing is that they're implementing, and the different kind of strategies that might be needed to make that happen. No matter what kind of study you're doing, all of those things are part of implementation research. So even if you're just at an exploratory or a pilot phase, you'd still be thinking about them. So feel free to grab those and kind of think about them or use them as the presentations are going. So today, we're going to be talking about study design, planning and documenting adaptations, which we talked about a little bit yesterday with implementation strategies with Katie Trinkley. And we'll be back talking about that more regarding the intervention or the thing that you're implementing. And then we will be talking about assessment and measures and partner engagement and having a wrap up. And that wrap up is going to have a lot of resources. So if you're able to stay on all the way to the very end of the wrap up, that would be fantastic. And thanks again to Accords Education and Sarah, who is here, and to the CCTSI DNI Core. We're like really grateful for everyone's support. Thanks for coming, you guys. I'm going to say let's begin, and I'm going to turn this over to our first presenter today, Jody Haltrop, who is the co-director of the DNI Science Core at Accords and an amazing implementation scientist and mixed methods expert who teaches in our certificate program as well. And you are going to learn a ton from her. And I'm going to try to figure out how to stop sharing my screen so she can share hers. Give
All
me a
right.
moment.
Okay, if the screen sharing works, then
I'm
I'll do
gonna,
that. Does that look right?
yes, we got it.
Okay, so now does it still look right?
Yes, looks better.
Okay, awesome. Well, hello everybody. Good to see you. And So I am going to do a really fast fly through a lot of information about study design as it relates to implementation science. So my hope is by the end of this presentation, you'll have a lot of ideas, not a lot of depth on everything, but a lot of ideas and things to think about. So we're going to cover some general considerations about study designs, talk about efficacy to implementation science designs, advanced designs, hybrid designs. So some basic study design questions that are relevant to all types of research. So things to be asking yourself about study designs in general is, what is the main thing? What is my primary question? Like, what am I trying to figure out? Where am I looking to answer it? How best could it be answered? How feasibly could it be answered? What do I have control over? Important question, because you don't have control over everything, right? What data are currently available? What data do I need to gather? These are broad questions that will help shape what is the best design. What you're trying to do is fit a design to what you are trying to do, not necessarily the other way around. But for implementation research, more specifically, there's a few extra questions we want to ask. If you're doing some basic D&I research, you might ask a question about how do specific partners or end users interpret information about implementation? If you're trying to do something applied, how does this intervention best get implemented in setting Y? You may have some measurement questions. How do I validly measure implementation outcomes? And you may have some design questions. How do I account for variation at multiple levels? How do I analyze outcomes when an intervention has changed over time? So these are some kind of extra layer things. They're a bit different to dissemination and implementation research versus other kinds of research. So, but overall, some study design ingredients, and your decisions will depend on where you are in the pipeline. Things like, what is your observation unit of analysis? What are the levels and methods of selection, randomization, or not? Intervention, measurement, your time factor, use of control or comparison group, types of data and analysis, which is loosely coupled with study design. Here's a reference to, do you love decision trees? Well, here you go. Here's one. It doesn't answer everything, of course, because decision trees can't answer everything. But this is by Mazuka and colleagues, a few years old, but still a good start to think about what you're trying to do. So you can see the beginning here is, what questions am I asking and what content will be answered? So the question is, what evidence do I need? Do I need qualitative? Do I need quantitative? Do I need both? Most D&I work really includes kind of both. But then the next question is, can I assign the exposure? Meaning, can I pick in some way whether a group gets an intervention or not? And so if no, then that gets you into the bucket of observational designs. But if yes, then you have to decide how you're going to handle the exposure, by group, by individual, by time. Should I randomize, or should I just put people in groups, or do I randomly, can I randomize? And then that's a good question, is whether you should randomize, because the answer is not always yes, you always should randomize when you can, but there are some different factors to think about. But if you can, and it's a good idea, then that would be an experimental design. But if it's not randomized, but you're going to have different groups, that would be quasi-experimental. Then the next question is, what is the level of my intervention? Now, remember, you heard about the thing and the stuff to do to get the thing to work, right? So intervention versus implementation strategy, you can study either of those or both, right? So is this an individual type of thing or a setting level? And if it's a setting or grouping kind of, then that's a clustered design. Over there on the right, the question is, can I follow people or collect data over time? And then there's some answers on that based on whether you want quantitative, qualitative, or you're not going to collect data over time in terms of some study designs. So keep in mind that there are different types of research, and the D&I research is up over in that yellow block box on the right. So keep in mind that when you're asking, could a program work or could an intervention work, whatever, you're in the realm of more efficacy studies. Does it work kind of out there is more effectiveness, and then making it work is more in the D&I realm. So the research that's uniquely D&I is going to be over there looking at exploration, adoption, implementation, and sustainment. So we're going to focus on the yellow box, and that means things might be a little bit different. So there's always some threats to validity, internal and external. Traditional research has been primarily concerned with internal validity. Can we show that this causes that? So the RCT, or randomized control trial, is considered the gold standard for that, because you want to get rid of all the other, reasons that something might happen other than your intervention. But in implementation science research, so you'll see I have IS in there, that's implementation science. We are concerned about both internal and external validity, with some extra weight on the external validity. So the external validity is the generalizability or representativeness, oh, lots of syllables, of findings, without which broad impact is not possible. So an RCT is a possibility for sure, but there are many quasi-experimental and non-experimental designs that can be even better as a fit for the kinds of questions you may be asking, because you're concerned also about this external validity. Threats to external validity are those that limit generalizability. So like, if I go out and I just pick out the most enthusiastic people who are super, super into the thing, that's not really representative of, oh, I'm just going to go to a general clinic and offer this. You're going to have, some people not wanting it, right? Because you've only studied the really enthusiastic people. So that's not very generalizable. Um, Treatment variations. If your study team is doing absolutely everything and it's really under tight control, that's not like real world, right? Because people have a lot of other things to do and a lot of other things to consider. So it's not like, that wouldn't be very externally valid if, you're expecting the study team behavior to be what is happening out there in clinical or community settings. Lack of generalizability about the outcomes. Do the outcomes matter to the people or just to kind of researchers? And then the context and settings and more. So study design options for implementation science research include lots of choices. So there's experimental, quasi-experimental, non-experimental, observational, and I don't know a lot about this personally, but computational modeling and simulation, and those are things that are increasingly occurring, and they are a way to do a design to look at outcomes. So I'm going to cover them very briefly, but that's not something I've done personally. What about hybrid designs? You've heard about effectiveness, implementation, hybrid designs. They're not really a design. They're kind of an approach. So we will cover that towards the end because that's a consideration. So another way to think about design options. So again, I'm trying to go through like, what are all the different kinds of things um, that to think about, right? So another aspect of this is within site, between site, and within and between sites. We tend to do a lot of within and between sites for implementation, research, dissemination, research. So within sites are things like within one particular organization or community or system, what is going on there. Between sites is between different organization systems. I am in family medicine, worked in family medicine my whole career, love it. Primary care is really important to me and to lots of people. We do a lot where we look at a lot of practices. So we look at, okay, how did this primary care practice operate differently from that one, from another, and what was alike and different about them. So we do a lot of that. So we kind of do both, the within and between at the same time. So another thing to think about. Now, this table is from a paper written by, I don't know, some guy named Russ Glasgow, who's written quite a few papers, really more about implementation, dissemination, research, and characteristics of the kind of research that we do and why certain things are important. So I couldn't go through this presentation without at least mentioning these things because they are important to study design considerations. And you'll see there's four main buckets there. That D&I research has a systems perspective. The idea is to have robust, but also practical goals for what we're trying to do, that we use research methods that enhance relevance because we're trying to figure out how something works out there in the world, not just in a controlled hypothetical situation, and that it's flexible. So you can read through this. The reference to the paper is there and in your workbook as well. But really thinking about things like context, multiple levels, being representative, being pragmatic, being rapid, being adaptive, using a lot of methods and integrating them, making sure it's relevant, etc. So these are some things to kind of cross-check yourself as you're going about your research. Okay, few words on the randomized controlled trial. RCT is a really important type of design, probably the most important for certain things. However, in D&I, it's been questioned a little bit more. And the reason is that the study of social change in complex systems may require us to do things a little bit differently. Because if we impose randomization on something, it might change what that something kind of is and operates like in a way that doesn't make it realistic to study. Now, if we're, doing more of a focus on the effectiveness of the intervention, yeah, that's probably a good idea, but it really depends. I'd like to encourage you to think about realist evaluation as a way to consider what you're studying. You can read all about that. I won't get into that, but it talks about what works for whom, in what respects. It kind of takes a deep dive into the aspects of the study using a context mechanism outcome type of framework. Berwick, many years ago, many assessment techniques were developed in engineering and used in quality improvement, and they have more power to inform about mechanisms and context than RCTs. So, for example, statistical process control, time series analysis, simulations, factorial experiments, ethnography, etc., and other methods might really get you more bang for your buck with what you're really, really trying to answer in more of an implementation outcomes kind of situation. All right, cluster randomized trials. So these are the randomized design, but also with clusters, you're randomizing sites rather than individuals. We do this a lot. As I said, I'm in family medicine. We do this a lot in family medicine because, if I teach one physician how to do something and then say, oh, only do that with certain patients. How do you think that's going to work out? They're not going to be able to not do that very well with the certain patients. Or if they have a team care aspect and they're trying to do things across a team and I, you know, have some of them do the intervention and not others, there is this likelihood of contamination on both of those things. So we'll often utilize a cluster design where we'll say, okay, this entire practice is doing this approach. And, then you're not kind of contaminating. There are issues of power due to clustering because your new node of analysis is the cluster, not the individual. So you're going to need more sites, which can be more expensive and difficult to do. Fun, but it's worth it. Issues with confounding, especially with only a few sites. So if you're going to, especially if you're going to do some of the adaptive designs or some of the, other more kind of complicated work, you're probably going to need quite a few sites. So good idea in a lot of cases, but, just something to plan for. Here's an example of, here is a study that Dr. Studts was involved with, Tina, who did our introduction today. And there was a study called Knapsack Can you just love that acronym?
It was
Has to
cute.
do, has to do you got to have a good acronym for your study, right? Okay, so it has to do with childcare in Kentucky. This is not my study. This is not my slide. So I'm going to give Tina the credit here. But they were looking at, and their cluster is these childcare centers, right? For the reasons I just mentioned about primary care practices. So really, you're randomizing the coaches, and then they get certain centers which do the intervention with certain children. So that's an example of that. And this is what kind of a modified consort diagram would look like, where you can see how it's really, kind of the same flow. You recruit, screen, you do baseline assessments, you randomize the coaches, and then there's Go Knapsack versus Enhanced Go Knapsack. That's so cute. Anyway, they get randomized to these clusters of groups, and then post-intervention and then follow-up. So kind of like a typical design, but the clusters are what get randomized. So now let's quickly go on to quasi-experimental designs. So this is when random assignment is not possible or you choose not to. And it's when external validity is very important and the intervention takes many forms and levels of quality, diversity of the population, requires multiple adaptations. We're going to hear about adaptations next from Borshika. Intervention is part of a complex multi-level approach requiring adaptation. So adaptations feature in this quasi-experimental designs. When a control or comparison group contamination is likely, like maybe you randomize and, there will be like close alignment between some sites and that could, contaminate. When there are issues with the unit of analysis, with a lot of D&I studies, we're trying to look at lots of different outcomes and lots of units of analysis. It gets very complicated. So a large unit where there is difficulty achieving adequate numbers could be a challenge. Um, I remember reading, now don't quote me on where this was exactly, but that many quasi-experimental designs actually can be as powerful as experimental designs. I think once you get out of your head that it has to be an RCT and get into your head that there are other ways of doing things, then, you know, then, um, you can explore this. I will also say that not all study sections are going to love this. Um, my very first R1 years ago, I proposed a quasi-experimental design originally, and they said, nope, it's got to be an RCT. And I fought back and said, this is why it doesn't need to be an RCT. This was during the time that you could do 2 submissions. Now you can only do 1 resubmission. But they were like, nope, RCT. And so anyway, I made it an RCT and it got funded. So, sometimes you just can't win the battle, but, just think about it. So some specific designs of interest in implementation science research that I'm going to go through for you to contemplate. We're not going to go through in depth, but is a stepped wedge design, interrupted time series, and then optimization adaptive trial. So these are some that um, might fit for what you want to do. So a stepped wedge design is where you randomize on which sites get the intervention through time. So you randomize on the time exposure. So what you can see here is that there are different clusters. So in this case, it looks like there's 24 clusters. Clusters go in groups of 4. Everybody has the same kind of run-in or baseline or kind of control period or comparison period. And then that blue would be when clusters 1 through 4 get the intervention, clusters 5 through 8 get the intervention. Okay, so you can see that, there's varying time to when the intervention happens. This is my own study that's almost done. We have a few months left, in this study. It's a R1 NIDDK study looking at weight management in primary care. And this was our design, as we use 3 clusters a year each. But you can see that there's a control condition and an intervention condition for each of, it was like about, I don't know, 17 to 19 different primary care practices that got into the intervention for each step here. So the reason why we chose this is that we knew eventually we wanted all of the practices to have the intervention, which is an EHR based care process for weight management and primary care. And so we knew we wanted all of them to have it. And so this made sense from that, which aided in recruitment and retention because they eventually all got the intervention and the implementation strategies. Um, some of the features specific to this one are the covariate constrained randomization. So we looked at what were the characteristics of the practices. You'll see some were academic and some were non-academic, and we wanted that to vary across. We looked at things like whether they were general internal medicine or family medicine, those kinds of things. Um, and anyway, these are the thing to keep in mind, unless you do a modified step to which design, is that you're collecting data at each crossover point. So you, for every um, cluster. So you collect information at all the time points. We collected data every 6 months, but at every crossover point from control to intervention, you have to make sure you have data. And this is pretty complicated to analyze, especially in real world. And we're muddling through finishing that now. There's always some limitations because this is real world happening, real world implementation. Anyway, so that, but I think it's still a very good design for the right type of thing. An interrupted time series design um, is one where you're going along, doing what you're doing. You put in an intervention, try not to change anything else, and then see what happens during that intervention period or implementation strategy period, and see if the slope, like the trajectory of the outcome that you're looking at, changes. So not going to get into that more. This one's pretty complicated, but pretty cool. Several people are using this. It's called the multi-phase optimization strategy. This isn't exactly a design. It's kind of like a combination of things. But basically what you're doing is there's 3 phases to it, kind of a preparatory phase where you try to determine what the components are that you want in your intervention or implementation strategies, or both. Then there's an optimization phase and then an evaluation phase. So this might work for your overall whole aims 1 through 3, on a study is looking at using most. Here's an example of an actual study. I have not used most myself. I do know some people that have, but this is a specific example of utilizing most for a family navigation intervention. So you can see those three categories of, kind of the phasic approach, that over on the left are standard family navigation components, and then they try to kind of optimize what those might be and how they might use them in terms of the delivery strategies. And then over on the right, they're looking at the outcomes in terms of capacity to pursue services, access, what their main outcomes are, and that would be their evaluation. So anyway, really cool design if it fits what you have to do, because it's kind of more comprehensive, includes a lot of things. A factorial design can be part of most. And the factorial design, the classic one is a 2x2 design. And this is when you want to separate out, okay, I want to look at this aspect of an intervention or implementation strategy and this aspect of an intervention or implementation strategy, both nothing with one only or together with both. And so you can see over here in these boxes, the opportunity to study the shared learning So practice facilitation alone is their no and no box top left. But if you want to study shared learning opportunities, this is going to be your top right box and your lower right box, okay, by itself and with educational outreach. Versus if you want to study the educational outreach component, that's your kind of bottom left and bottom right boxes in terms of studying those, one by itself, one with. So this works out well. Again, you're going to have a number of groups um, to be able to do this. I want to do this for a study. It is pretty complicated. I've written it into a proposal, and then my statisticians said, nope, nope, we're, not a good idea to do this. So it works a little bit better with individuals, but you can do it with clusters. This is called the sequential multiple assignment randomized trial or SMART trial design, and you can incorporate this into MOST as well as part of what you're trying to do. But essentially what you're doing is you have kind of a run-in period and you have kind of all your individuals of your sites. This was developed around like drug trials. And so then you look at what happens and you predetermine decision points for randomization. So this does include randomization, which is the circle with the R in it. Is that in this case, this was Amy Kilborn's study um, looking at what is this one about? A mood disorders program. So they are trying to see if there's a response to this, let's say, mood disorders program. I haven't read this paper in depth, but out of the non-response, they like the people who are responding keep going, but the non-responders get randomly assigned to external facilitation or internal and external facilitation. So they're randomizing on the implementation strategy. And so those who only get the external facilitation, then you look and see what happens. You have to define what your response is. So you've got responders and non-responders. And then the responders, some of them, the responders just keep going with that. And then the non-responders get randomized again. They continue with it or they get the internal facilitation added. And then you can compare to the internal plus external facilitation group and look at who responds and who doesn't. Now, the advantage of this is if you want to add things, you want to say like, okay, it's cheaper to just do one implementation strategy than four of them, right? So if so, then let's see how much we can get away with just doing one of them and then add things later. Whereas that factorial design, you're kind of doing one or the other or both kind of thing. So this is another way that you can separate out, okay, do we need to add more? There are a lot of non-experimental designs, not going to get into them, but want to mention them. They are cross-sectional studies, case control studies. So you've got a case and then a kind of matched control, which is kind of like a non-experimental, but a little bit different. Longitudinal cohorts, geographic mapping. So there's lots of these kinds of designs as well. When might you choose a non-experimental design? When there's no possibility of a valid control or comparison group, you only have the group, and that's just the group you have. When the main interest is establishing base measurements rather than like comparing, when the main interest is hypothesis generation rather than hypothesis testing, and when the interest is in exploring important aspects of context and temporality or time. All right, computational modeling designs can be important when there are no empirical data or they're really, really hard to get. So you're kind of creating a hypothetical situation. And when you're trying to understand maybe what some mechanisms might be that would feature, so maybe you might do this before you do a study or instead of another like study design that we just talked about. When the interest is exploring and understanding system dynamics like feedback loops, unintended consequences, rich effects of behavior, and when it's difficult or impossible to do a traditional empirical design. So like maybe you want to explore how multiple interventions or policies interact. I don't know if this is really true, but maybe when it's just something you wouldn't do, like you wouldn't, like your traditional example of, oh, you guys smoke for the rest of your life and you guys don't. We'll see what happens to you. Like if you have a reasonable thought that something is going to be a harm to participants, you wouldn't want to actually do that with them. So that might be another case. So complex systems and complexity science is fascinating because it's really what the world is like. And we try to fit all these complex things into very linear systems of studying them. And that's not really what happens in the world. So this diagram that's complicated, not complicated, it's complex. Complicated means you can break it apart and understand it and figure out the mechanisms. Complex is everything interacts with everything else through time. So like complex is like, how would you study the, phenomena of parenting, right? I mean, it's like all these things happening at the same time, over time, interacting with the parent and the child and the other people and right? So, what you are doing is trying to model out what might happen by putting in the main things that are important. So, but some features here is that a complex system involves many components that are dynamically interacting. There are lots of scales and but there are some common behaviors. So anyway, it produces different effects through time based on different things going on. So you say, how in the world would I study this? It's just kind of like a mess, right? So here's a diagram of, gosh, I think this has to do with tobacco regulation. So you can see how there's different things going on. There's government regulation, there's tobacco research, there's individual behaviors, there's tobacco control programs, there's tobacco industry, there's economics. So there's all these different things going on. Computationally, you can try to model these things. And the three ways that this is often done are using systems dynamics modeling, network analysis, and agent-based modeling. So we're not going to get into those today, but you can see the three pictures over on the right. The top picture has to do with systems dynamics and using computer simulations to model out how might things happen with wolves versus sheep. If this happens with sheep, if we were going to model that out with wolves, what would that look like? The network analysis is the little, dots with the lines connecting them. I have done network analysis. That's pretty cool. And it looks at the study of relationships between entities or people and flows among them and how that can influence outcomes. And then agent-based modeling looks at different trajectories of things and uses computer simulations to examine how elements of a system can behave as a function of their interaction. So what you do is you put in like kind of the main drivers and the main agents in it, and then the computer kind of models out what might happen based on those things. So it's very important with that you really have a good idea of what are the main things that will influence what dynamics are happening. Okay, a few words. This is the last set of slides here, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. Um, so I said at the beginning that effectiveness implementation studies, it's not really a study design. You can use any study design with this approach. Experimental, quasi-experimental, non-experimental. So what makes a hybrid a hybrid? This is the seminal article on hybrid designs, getting a little old now. Wow, 13 years old since that came out, by Jeffrey Curran. Effectiveness implementation hybrid designs. And there have been some adaptations to this also made by some others in terms of kind of drilling down to some more details. But in this particular paper, that there are three types of hybrid. Over on the left is a type 1, and over on the right is a type 3, and in the middle is a type 2. The type 1 focuses more on the kind of effectiveness, efficacy part of the equation. It looks at implementation, but it doesn't necessarily focus mostly on that. Whereas the type 3 is the opposite. you're testing the implementation strategies and then gathering information on the clinical outcomes. And then the type 2 is in the middle. So why do hybrid designs? The rationale is the speed of moving research findings into routine use in actual practice could be improved by considering hybrid designs because they can maybe get you there faster. They don't wait for perfect effectiveness data before moving to implementation research. You do need some efficacy or effectiveness data before you would move into any of these, but it doesn't have to be perfect and completely done, especially if you're moving from one setting or target population to another or something like that. You can backfill the effectiveness data while you're testing the implementation strategies, explore implementation while testing effectiveness, and can combine questions like how do clinical outcomes relate to levels of adoption and fidelity. So anyway, uh, um, I like these because if you design some perfectly effective intervention, but it never has feasibility, acceptability, it never can actually run in an actual delivery setting, you kind of spend a lot of time on something that's never going to help anybody. So getting there, testing out that part of how does this run in the world a little sooner can make things a little bit more efficient. So examples of research aims by hybrid types. So a hybrid type 1, the hybrid type 2 gets confusing for everybody. And it's like, how do I do that one? But the hybrid type 1 is you're trying to primarily determine the effectiveness of an intervention. So you really kind of want to make sure that it's delivered with fidelity to as much as possible with some adaptations. But, that's kind of your primary thing. And then at the same time, you're looking at understanding the context, like what kinds of contextual things influence how this goes. So you're really focusing more on trying to figure out if it's if it's effective. Whereas a type 3 hybrid is the primary aim is really looking at the implementation strategy. You know the intervention itself, which is the thing that's directed at the patient or the, participant. You know that works, but this is kind of where we are with our pathway study that I gave you the cluster randomized step wedge example is that, um, yeah, it looks like it works, but the uptake was not as optimal as it could be. So now we're going to focus on how do we get people to adopt it and take it up and use it correctly and all of that. And we're going to still look at what happens to patients' weights. But the main thing is really trying to look at the implementation outcomes. And then hybrid type 2 is in the middle, where usually the primary aim is still the effectiveness in an intervention, but there's a co-primary aim of also looking at an implementation outcome um, as um, at the same time. So you're not just looking at the intervention and what the implementation context is, but you're also kind of looking at implementation strategies. So common challenges in the review of hybrids. There is a disagreement about how much evidence is enough to move into this. That used to be something that people would get criticized for in their applications, and especially in like a DNI focused kind of study section. Maybe not as much today, but that is still a big question. Um, what if the interventionist and or the context is really different than in the effectiveness trials? How different is too different for a hybrid? That's a hard thing to answer in a quick presentation like this, but something to think about. Not enough data on the barriers facilitators to justify selection of a proposed implementation strategy. So you want to really have enough evidence for your intervention, but you also want to have some evidence around like what's going on, why did you pick the implementation strategies you did to study, how did you get there? And no pilot data on the implementation strategy for a type 3. You would want to have done some pilot work. So more on type 1 hybrids. The original definition of a type 1 emphasized secondary aims question and exploratory data collection analysis preparatory to an implementation activity. Um, The most common model is of a type 1. However, some type 1 studies are doing more intense focus on implementability. Uh, what if you have a small number of sites, expand the data collection to naive sites, clinics not yet doing the thing? Type 2 hybrids, the original definition described dual focus, but um, but they're really randomized effectiveness trials nested in pilots of an implementation strategy. And the majority of type 2s do tend to be the latter. Some do dual randomized designs. That is more complicated and you need more sites probably. So anyway, so looking at the aims or hypotheses of existing studies, most have a primary aim on the intervention outcomes. A little bit more about that is need an explicitly described implementation strategy is thought to be plausible in the real world, which is the distinction from type 1, and explicit measurement of adoption and fidelity always happens in type 2. Need to be clear about intervention components versus implementation strategy components. So this is a little bit fuzzier. Um, and the thing that's really confusing about all this is the italicized words at the bottom. Is delivering an intervention over the telephone an intervention component or an implementation strategy? It's confusing because what is the intervention? What is the implementation strategy? Because an implementation strategy is an intervention, right? So it's really a matter of picking. I tend to be more of a traditionalist and saying the intervention is the thing directed at the patient for a patient outcome. I work in the world of patients, so I'm using that example, but it's directed at the change in the, in the patient. So in my, um, example with pathway, the evidence-based intervention is like the weight management treatments. And the, implementation part of it can be pathway. But then we've kind of evolved to pathway, which is the care process, is actually the intervention. And then things like practice facilitation and training are the implementation strategy. So it's really a matter of how you want to define things and just be consistent and clear throughout your proposal. Okay, almost done. Um, I think I'm going to kind of skip through this. Be careful about carefully selecting implementation strategies. Make sure to adoption and fidelity benchmarks are included, and build in measurement plans to address poor adoption or fidelity and build in time to deal with that. Type 3, important to use an outcomes framework like REAIM, Proctor's implementation outcomes framework, CFER's outcomes, those kinds of things. And make sure to look at cost. Usually you want to be part of that because if there's no way to pay for it, that's not very realistic. And the clinical outcomes data may be just more part of um, uh, in existing data. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I see that lots of things happened in chat. So I will start at the beginning and see. Okay, so we've got until 10:05. Is that right?
Yep, you have about 15 minutes.
Okay. Yay, 15 minutes. I hope these are not too hard for me. Let me see.
Answered the easy ones already.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe someone should tell me what the questions are rather than me look through chat because
He
have
helps.
some been, I thought we were not answering in chat.
Just a couple of them along the way. So I'll start at the beginning here. So are there study designs or frameworks that could combine work before implementing an RCT, like an assessment of environmental readiness, and after, such as sustainability, with the quantitative outcomes of the RCT for a more complete picture of the effective implementation of an intervention?
Well, I mean, there are DNI frameworks that have more of a time phase to them, like EPIS, which stands for exploration, preparation, implementation, sustainment. And that's a DNI framework, but that's not going to be like a study design. It's more like a framework. Um, and it kind of goes through time where you could look at replicating effective programs, which you have experience with, Bethany, does that as well. It's got kind of like some phases to it. So there are some frameworks that include phases, but I have used and am using EPIS, but I think, a lot more is I'd probably pick a framework, a D&I framework that works for you, and then you can put in your study design over time. I use the example of MOST. So MOST has that in it, where there's a phase of preparing what are your components going to be, and then you do, an optimization phase, which usually is a smart design, where you're trying to optimize, and then you actually, you're kind of narrowing down what you're working on throughout the whole thing. And then you say, oh, these are the things that I'm going to study. And then the final phase is evaluation. But most people tend to do things where they have aim one, maybe they'll do some preparatory work and then say aim one is to determine what the thing is, what the intervention, what the implementation strategies are, and then you actually test it, and then you have another aim looking at like studying all the other stuff, the contextual stuff. So this is where like PRISM works really well because it has re-aim in it, which is the outcomes, and then it's got the contextual parts in it, which is the PRISM parts. That you can study like what influenced adoption and implementation and maintenance and those kinds of things. But really it's more, um, obviously if you're doing something over time, you want something that includes a longitudinal element, not like something cross-sectional. I don't know. I'm a favor of mixing things up a lot as long as it's not too complicated and it's pretty clear what you're doing. Does anyone have any more ideas on that?
And just the process frameworks are really good for
Mhm.
some of those preparatory stages, early conceptualization and design phases, context assessment phases. And so what is being mentioned in the chat there, I do think process frameworks are a great way to consider that. Uh,
I think Borshika will talk a little about this in the next session too, in terms of like adaptation frameworks where you're sort of assessing and determining the need for any kind of adaptation. And a similar process is you can be used for like identifying barriers and facilitators that you then select implementation strategies for, and doing that in partnership, like with all of the agencies, uh, recipients, interventionists, or intervention agents that you're working with to try to kind of co-decide or co-create what that plan is going to be. And I think Jody's right. Like if you use a framework, a D&I framework, that can capture like kind of the whole process. But then it's almost like you need a different study design for each phase of that. Like, so one thing might be descriptive, one thing might be a trial, one thing might be using user-centered design to make decisions. So it's more, I don't think there is like a study design that captures everything, but there are frameworks that can capture it all.
looks like we have a couple other questions about MOST. So you said the smart design is usually what's used in MOST. What are some other study designs for that evaluation component that fit within MOST?
I am not an expert on most. I think maybe some of you might know a little bit more about most. I know Danielle Ostendorf, who was here, has most built into her study. She left for Tennessee, but I mean, the idea is that in the middle there's this optimization phase, and so some sort of design that would get you to optimizing what your intervention or implementation strategy package would be is what happens in that middle phase. So, an adaptive design, which is a smart design, would allow you to do that because you can see, okay, if I do this and I add this, then I add that, then I add that, like how each of those things. But keep in mind, if you do that, you're adding, if you really need like a big bang for your buck all at once, you might want to do some kind of factorial where it's like this group gets this group gets this, and this group gets those two, and this group gets three things all together, whatever, all at the same time, because maybe it's like okay, you just start off with training and people are like, nah, you know, and then they lose enthusiasm and you can add things later, but they're already lost, you know? So that's another consideration. Um, I don't know if you have to use smart or if you can use other designs in the middle. I don't think you have to,
Yeah. Yeah, you can
but
use partial or full factorial designs or
okay.
just an
Okay.
RCT.
Those are definitely, I think they're like they have more power because you're doing like something's on and off, on and off, on and off. So you've got all this,
Right.
it's hard to look at interactions usually, but you can look at the main effects of each thing that you've turned on or off pretty efficiently in those. So I think that a lot of people will use those. And there's a lot of good resources on those partial factorials. Like designing those is a little bit tricky, thinking about like what conditions you need present. But there's a lot of good information from Linda Collins online about that.
I see the question about does SMART account for late effective interventions? I don't know for sure the answer on that. I mean, I think statistically there's some things that you can do to look at, time of exposure, but it's never perfectly gonna correct for everything. I mean, same thing with stepped wedge designs. You have to account for, the fact that like the last group is going to have less time to get exposed and than the first group, and different things happen through time. So I don't know that you can perfectly, it's really like there's every design is going to have a problem or more problems. It's just trying to minimize the problems for what you're trying to do. So that's really the trade-off there. Does anyone have another answer for that?
I mean, it
Or
depends on the timing.
right.
You know, you, if it takes a year for your effect to be realized, well, then quite possibly you could miss it.
Yeah.
But if it's something that happens quickly, then unlikely. So it just depends on how much time you have in each of your different stages of the project.
Right. So if time is going to be a major factor, then you might not want to do certain designs. Um, Kind of that big bang for your buck kind of thing concept. Is hybrid another term for mixed methods? Okay, good. Yeah, thanks. It looks like you answered that.
And then is there a rule of thumb for a number of clusters? I wish.
It's like always more than you have. That's the rule of
Yeah.
thumb.
I mean, this is where, so we originally were trying to do this follow-up on Pathway, and we went to NIH and said, we think we're going to need like 150 practices, and this is going to cost more than, you do a power calculation, just like you do a power calculation for anything. How much effect are you looking for in your main outcome, and what's the intercluster correlation, consideration? You do those with your statistician, and then it ends up being a lot. And, we were kind of like, can we go over the cap? No, we're not doing that anymore. It's like, oh, okay, well, how do we fund this? So anyway, it gets hard. But no rule of thumb, but you just do a power calculation, which this is the reason why we stopped the adaptive design and we're now going towards a more cluster randomized design again, because it was just
Yeah.
too many practices.
And it's hard with those adaptive designs. Like if if you have people in an original condition and then you do something like the high responders just keep getting what they were getting and the low responders get re-randomized to something else, then you've now created more groups and comparisons, which then affects your power. And so like in a lot of smart trials, they're really only powered for that first outcome. And then everything after that, the number of sites per condition has now like lowered. And so they often lose power, kind of like the more adaptive things you do and the longer it goes, then those tend to be like more exploratory at the end because you just don't have the sample size you need anymore to test. There's a good question I want to make sure we get to before Borshika comes about costs. Nate Carroll asked about mentioning the importance of cost, especially in type 3, but it's really all like cost is big in implementation science. And so suggestions for identifying collaborators with expertise in cost. What would you guys say?
Well, Accords here, if you're at the University of Colorado, does have an economic section core, so you could ask about that. But usually, you would want economist, health economist, who does something called TDABC, time-driven activity-based costing, and looks at return on investment analysis. Because a lot of economists, they do this like, oh, if we do this, what does society get? You know, and that's good. And they do things like qualies and all of that. But really, for implementation, it's like if I'm trying to implement this thing in a child care center or a primary care practice or whatever, how much is it going to cost my practice to do this thing? You know, and then how much money will I get back? And so I'm using this pathway example because it's what I'm familiar with, and we are measuring all of these things. And we're looking at, okay, can you use regular E&M billing? What do you bill for? What level can you bill for when you do a pathway visit versus another kind of weight management visit versus a not doing weight management? You know, how do you kind of compare those things out? And does it take my staff more time to do this? Because basically, if you can't get paid for it, how much do you think it's going to happen? You know, I mean, not much because they have to make money to keep their practice open, right? So anyway, cost is a really, really important feature. I would also encourage you to look, and PCORI's more like this, at resources needed. So it's not just how much does it cost and how much you get back, but it's the resources overall, like, yeah, and this is a different way of looking at cost as well, but say you can make money doing weight management and primary care, but no one has any accessibility. Like no one has time in their workflow. And, you know, like that's a resource that's kind of a problem from an implementation perspective. There's no way, you know, to overcome that. That's also, I guess, I think a lot of this I look at is what's going to make it not happen? What's going to make it not happen well? And those are the business of DNI.
So
I
we
just
should transition to
Yes.
our next talk. Um,
Yep.
with if you can see the chat right now before the next presentation comes on, we just put a few resources in the chat specifically around
Great.
costing resources.
Thank you. They don't have to do TDABC, but that is a main method that's used. All right, so
Thank you, Jody. That was amazing.
yeah, fly through a million things.
You got through a lot.
All right, well, have fun with it. And you're always going to later go, oh my gosh, I should have done something else, and you probably shouldn't have, but it just always feels like that in the middle. So, all right, well, have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks. Next up, we have Dr. Borska Rubin, who's going to be talking about planning and documenting adaptations. I'll turn it over to Borska.
Thank you so much, Bethany, and welcome everyone again. I was very excited to be part of the conversation yesterday. We had also, for some of you, an intensive in the afternoon, which was really powerful. I thought we learned about each other's projects a lot. Adaptations kept coming up, asking about, what do you do? Do you adapt or do you co-create? Lots of good questions. So today, what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk faster than I did yesterday, which is almost impossible. I just checked, I have 63 slides. I'm not going to miss any of them, but I'm not going to get into detail on any of them either. So the purpose, again, just like yesterday, to give you a general overview of what adaptations are, why do we care about them, and then talk a little bit about both pre-implementation adaptations, but then also how do we deal with adaptations that happen during implementation, which is very apropos from the previous conversation when Jody talked about adaptive designs and all of those things that I will not be able to dig into very deeply, but they are very appropriate to consider those. So we are linking all of these presentations very tightly. So with that in mind, I'm going to share actually slides. Let me put them into a presentation mode. And yeah, encouraging you to use the chat as you have been doing it for questions. We will see how well I do and whether I can give a little time for Q&A at the end. If not, then we will use those questions to answer those, and Tina knows the process of moving them into a separate document. Already highlighted the topics I'm going to cover, but perhaps I will say that in addition to talking about planning for adaptations, I also want to give you a little bit of guidance on how to think of documenting and analyzing adaptations. Again, just a very surface information. A lot of my work is focused in this area, so many of the slides or kind of data that I show is actually emerging from various studies. This is just a sampling of colleagues that I have worked with to think about these methodologies, so I just wanted to acknowledge them. If you could actually put in the chat while I am advancing, what is the most burning question about adaptations that you hope that I will answer for you, then we could do a little reality check at the end, whether I covered those, and then we could potentially expand my presentation. So please drop this in the chat. And then let me just jump right in. First of all, I want to acknowledge the elephant in the room. I am not talking about fidelity today. Fidelity is certainly an area that most of you are already incorporating into your work. Most of our trainings include a strong focus on fidelity, even to date, and kind of just considerations of how not to change things. And so I am thinking about, and I will, present this in a moment, adaptation and fidelity, they coexist. I am assuming you know much more about fidelity than adaptation, so our focus is on adaptations here. But I am certainly not repressing or suppressing fidelity, and you will see how I bring that in. I am using a very broad definition for adaptations. The literature has different ways of thinking about it, so please check all those different publications that I am listing throughout this, and then also as you are citing literature, make sure that your definition of adaptations is cited to the right author. But I like to talk about adaptations as any change or modification to an intervention, implementation strategy, or context. So any change. There are other definitions that limit adaptations to more of planned type of modifications, and modifications are seen as a larger umbrella, but in my work, I am kind of using these interchangeably. Also, adaptations happen all the time, and most of the time when they happen, they are being done to improve the fit of the intervention or the implementation strategy with a given context. It could be a new context, and actually we are always in a new context. You think about, we never step in the same river, even within the same study and the same sites, you are constantly dealing with a new context over time. As I mentioned, adaptations are common. I don't think they can be avoided. And the main consideration or concern people have is that when we make adaptations, we lessen the effectiveness of our interventions. And so that's kind of the balance that we need to deal with. So basically, adaptations are inherent and crucial part of implementation. And if we ignore them, we might miss the opportunity of implementing, because if you don't improve the fit of the intervention or the implementation strategy to the context, there will be no implementation. And so this implementation failure is the cost of ignoring adaptations and need for adaptations. Again, historically, we have put much more emphasis on fidelity. That was the good guy. And then the bad guy, the adaptation, the change is what we kind of saw as something to avoid or defeat. There is definitely a tension between adaptations and fidelity, just like there is between internal and external validity. But I think that the mature view of fidelity and adaptation should be that they need to coexist. And if they work together well, then we are actually going to implement better. And so going with the times, two superhero women are seen as kind of collaborating around adaptations and fidelity. If I wanted to oversimplify the idea of adaptations, I would direct you to this visual, and perhaps that's kind of enough for many of you that, I don't want to go too deep. I just want to know, what is going on. And then you can use this kind of thinking of, adaptations will happen at different time points in the study, pre-implementation, implementation, and sustainment. Yes, During implementation and sustainment, there will be adaptations. I am so sorry to break that news, even though that will mess up your design. And as you know, you heard it, sometimes you cannot use a design that will allow for all those adaptations in a neat way. So you have to account for them. And then the adaptations can also happen to interventions, implementation strategies, and context. So all of those different areas. Of course, I'm not going to stay this simple. I'm going to dig in. Just a brief note that this publication, the Dynamic Sustainability Framework, provides a really nice frame why we need to continue doing adaptations and why we can expect that if we do the same thing over time, even within the same study, then we are going to have to expect some drop in voltage because the interventions fit with the context is not going to maintain the same level of alignment, and we need to make changes to adapt to the changing context. This is well represented here as well. As we think about different time points and different settings, there is a need for constant readaptation. And I think that that's just a reality. And the secret sauce behind this need is fit or alignment, that we constantly have to optimize fit and alignment. We yesterday talked a little bit, Tina brought up this visual at a minimum. This ugly figure is really giving me a heartburn right now, procedures in the same row. But just to think that, you know, all the different things that you are implementing, it's complex. There are so many different types of things that you are implementing. And often we don't know what is actually the active ingredient of these. We are just tasked with getting them into practice. Complexity is very inherent in the work that we do. If you were to, we had time and I would stop sharing and I would ask you, share with me the interventions or things, one of the 7 Ps that you are interested in implementing. I am going to make a bet that I can show you that every single one of those that you are implementing is a complex intervention. No simple interventions are being put into place when you are working in real world settings. Even something like a pill, a COVID-19 vaccine, which is a very distinct thing, is a very complex intervention. And I don't have to explain to this crowd why I say that. So there is this whole idea of complexity. There is this whole idea that the different components of the intervention are not the same as the combined intervention. And I use this visual because I'm a knitter, is that just having the ingredients of, you know, a knitting needle, beautiful yarn and a pattern will not lead to that beautiful shawl on the left, although I finally completed it, but it took me like 5 years. So for a long time, I didn't think that it will come together. So I really felt strongly about this visual. Complexity just in general, thinking about intervention complexity is very important in the context of adaptations. And I love, there are a number of really good publications. I am showing them on the left up kind of angle of the, or corner of this slide. Please visit those. They are wonderful ways of thinking about complexity. And it's complexity that makes it hard to easily differentiate core elements and, you know, changeable elements of an intervention, which is usually the biggest advice we get, that just change the, you know, the non-core elements and leave the core elements alone. It's not that easy. And I really love to think about that complexity happens in different levels, whether it's intervention, complexity, pathway, population, etc. So dig into this literature because you are implementing complex interventions. I also love to think about the definition of context. And there is a series of papers, and I will show that in a moment, which initiative generated them, that use a much more fluid and organic way of defining interventions and contexts, which makes me so much happier because it is the way that we can get away from this conundrum of how are we going to remain rigorous. So in this quote, it says, context can be thought of as a set of characteristics, circumstances that consist of active and unique factors within which the implementation of an intervention is embedded. And the actual intervention effect is generated through the interaction of new ways of working with existing contexts. So your definition that there is an evidence-based intervention without context is not aligning with this definition, which suggests that intervention effect comes into play once you are making changes within a given context. So that really explains the importance of alignment. We move on. And then I love this definition of intervention as well, where they say that an intervention can be seen as a critical event in the history of a system, leading to the evolution of new structures of interaction and new shared meanings. Intervention's impact on evolving networks of person, time, place interaction, changing relationships, displacing existing activities, and redistributing and transforming resources. And I know that this is a lot, but this is such a different way of defining what an intervention is than we traditionally have done. Very often our interventions are defined as a series of activities, very, very specific activities. This is very different from how it is described in this slide, which actually helps us understand why, again, alignment and context is so important. So again, when we get this advice that, oh, you can easily balance fidelity and adaptation, just take apart the core components from the peripheral components. It's not that easy. Yet another yarn metaphor that I enjoy. One of the things that I have found helpful to get to the bottom of things is start with logic models. In this workshop, we are really emphasizing them because those who are a little bit newer to implementation science, often not new to logic models. And so I am showing here actually really impressive logic model from colleagues here at UCSD, Dr. Laramie Smith and Jill Blumenthal, from their study where and this is not version 1, this is perhaps version 21 of their logic model, but they developed this with collaboration of their partners and incorporated theories, models, and frameworks. In fact, they used PRISM, which we brought up yesterday, using as the determinant contextual elements, and then the REM outcomes of PRISM in the last, most to the right box. So you can combine these two. And often when you start to put together a logic model, you actually get really challenged to identify why you are doing things. And that can start to help you understand what should be changed and what should not be changed. So this is kind of a first step and another encouragement to you to explore this implementation research logic model or some form of logic model. The other thing that I am looking at Tina and others on the team, I don't think we covered functions and forms in any of our prior presentations. Is that true? Perfect. I am not going to do justice to this, and I shouldn't, because actually Monica Perez-Yales should be the one who is talking about this. She has developed really incredible operationalization of these concepts, but functions and forms are another way to get around this, again, paradigm of changing certain things and not others. If you took apart your intervention to what are the core functions that I am trying to achieve and what forms those could take, then you could say that I am allowing adaptations to the forms while I am maintaining or making sure that I am still delivering the core function. And this was really beautifully presented in Monica's publication in 2019, where she took the patient-centered medical home, which has certain principles, identified related core functions, and then allowed FQHCs to identify the forms in which they want to deliver those. And I don't think I have many more slides here, but let me give you an example. So one of the core functions of the patient-centered medical home is to increase access to care for patients. And so Monica worked with these FQHCs, and they identified a number of ways that the FQHC could achieve that function. So instead of all FQHCs as a result of this function would have to be open longer hours, some FQHCs chose that, others decided to have weekend hours, and again, others might have chosen to use a telemedicine approach where patients would have easier access. All of those were still serving the same function of increased access to care, but based on the priorities and resources of the FQHC, they could choose different forms. This idea of functions and forms really took off over the past few years. I don't have that many studies cited here, but I'm happy to share. There are so many other great examples where this has been used. And Monica recently, with other colleagues, of course, released a beautiful tool that you can access that provides you with background information about complex interventions, forms, and functions, also some examples, and also some great tools, templates that you can use as you are trying to work this through. So I would like to direct your attention to these. The idea is that if you know what the functions are, then the forms are a little bit more flexible, so adaptations can be kept at the form level. The truth is that sometimes you are going to make changes to functions, and we can talk about that later. Another topic I wanted to hit on is this idea of adaptations before implementation. And this actually came up in our intensive small group yesterday, where we talked about, what kind of frameworks can you use to guide those pre-implementation adaptations. The publication from Cam Escoffery is, I'm not remembering which year, I don't think it's here, but it's been a few years. However, it was such an incredibly well done review that I still direct everyone to this. There are 13 frameworks that they identified. And once they identified the frameworks, they found that there are 11 common steps across all of those frameworks. Not all of them number it up to 11, but these 11 ideas are incorporated. So the message is you can use any of those 13 frameworks, whichever you feel comfortable with, because you are kind of going to do the same thing. Or you could use these 11 steps, in fact. Beautiful way of organizing your proposals, especially if you have a specific aim that is focused on adaptation pre-implementation. And there are a number of publications that will give you guidance on how to operationalize these frameworks. I'm highlighting a couple just to make it a little bit more touchable. Adapt It, many of you have heard of it. It's been used broadly in HIV context, also global health. Many examples in the literature of how to apply it. They have 8 steps, which kind of incorporates those 11 things that I mentioned earlier. So recommend it. Another one that has very nice visualization and support materials is I Am Adopt. There is a website. This is the same group that developed implementation and intervention mapping, Maria Fernandez's group. A very good one because, again, when you are developing proposals, visuals are wonderful. They have additional resources to work with. So those are the 2 I am usually highlighting. It doesn't mean that the others are not great, and feel free to look at those through that paper. One framework that came out after the Cam Escoffery's paper is the ADOPT study, Decipher study that resulted in another framework. This is that series of publications I was referencing. It was led by UK colleagues. And I feel like when we get publications from Europe, they just get a little bit more organic. They are willing to get into this gray space. So they talk about, as I showed, interventions and context in a different way. Really a beautiful series of publications. They came up with this visual. Surprise, 11 steps. And it's kind of, again, mapping onto those common 11 steps that were identified. They also used the phases from the EPIS framework, exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment to organize these steps, but it's very similar. So you can also use this. So I am going to limit my discourse about planning for implement or adaptations, pre-implementation, because there's just so much out there on it. But I will just say that the devil will be in the details. So even though you will have these beautiful frameworks, the actual decision-making continues to be challenging. Hopefully you are engaging multiple partners. What if your patients are telling you one adaptation and your clinical partners are recommending other? How do you make decisions about what adaptations will be made and what are going to be kept as a no-no? All of those are actually much more complex. And I'm not showing a publication here, but one of my colleagues and also a student in our certificate program in Colorado, Emily Treichler, wrote a very nice paper addressing those delicacies of decision-making between veterans and clinician partners. And she's the developer of the intervention, the tension of making decisions, what gets changed, what doesn't get. So the last topic that I'm going to hit on is documenting adaptations. There are many reasons why we would want to do that. And this applies to pre-implementation, but especially during implementation, when we actually are sometimes assuming that there are no adaptations. Again, there are. And if we ignore those, then we will not know what actually we implemented. We will not have information on how we could improve implementation in future sites if you are doing a stepped wedge trial, for example, and you would not have a sense of what recommendations you make for future implementers in a scale up or scale out situation. So having this information is important. We sometimes are reluctant to collect it because we are not supposed to make changes, but I tell you that we are in the process of using adaptation documentation in a large NCI efficacy trial series. And we have identified across the 4 projects already 162 adaptations. So even in the efficacy context, adaptations happen. Perhaps you could put in the chat, are you documenting fidelity and adaptation in your study? And I don't want you to use these answer options necessarily, but if you could just put in there, are you documenting fidelity and are you documenting adaptations? So I will look at that later. So there is the big question of then when, what, who, and how you document as it relates to adaptations. It can become really heavy in terms of, work heavy for your research assistants or your even implementers. So you want to be thoughtful about this. The simplest way would be to use this table and just simply fill it out retrospectively. You could sit down as your research team and you could just go ahead and identify what adaptations happened and in this phase. Do I recommend this? I would say that it's better than nothing. Are you going to remember all the important adaptations looking back? I'm not sure, but perhaps that's all you have resources for, and that's fine. So I am just going to say that set an adaptation documentation that will fit with your study resources interest. It is critically important to be on the same page with everyone who is thinking about adaptations in terms of what is the intervention. Very often the first barrier to documenting adaptation, that each partner has a different understanding of what we are implementing. So it's hard to tell whether something changed when you are all thinking of something else. So in our colorectal cancer screening study at UCSD, we provide a visual to remind people of the different steps of the process. And then we ask them to use this to prompt their memory about any change compared to this process. You can find creative ways of reminding people of what the intervention is and coming to the same page. The data collection methods can be super creative. I am listing here a few methods that we have used. Interviews, periodic reflections, observations, real-time tracking, etc. I'm not going to read all of this. The limit is the sky, and your method could be really, a very different way of documenting adaptations depending on what resources you have in place. I'm going to highlight a couple. We have actually an interview guide that we developed, which is a 45-minute interview guide for documenting adaptations. We sometimes use it. Most of the time, we pick a few questions from it and put it into another interview that we are already planning to do. But if you want to get really hardcore, you can use the full set. How many of you, well, I'm not going to see it, but how many of you are familiar with Periodic Reflections by Aaron Finley and colleagues? I'm going to go back. I'm trying to see you all, and it's a very not successful process. Okay, now I can see many of you at least. So anyways, it's a really neat and very intuitive process. I recommend you look it up, Periodic Reflection, Aaron Finley, and Tina might drop it in the chat for me if I may ask you, Tina, on that. And I might actually have it coming up. Really nice process, bringing teams together, thinking about adaptations together. Real-time tracking, we always have a real-time tracking database that we use. We have a REDCap-based template that we are happy to share with you. We have shared many times. Those need to be adopted, very meta, adopting the adaptation database. But it's a nice way to have all of your data in one place and have someone enter it. And then we see this is the Word version of some of the fields that are going into that adaptation database for our same colorectal cancer screening study. And then this is, again, just a portion of our REDCap database. We change it for every study, make sure that it's relevant to that study. Process maps was a very neat thing that we have done. We had study at the VA in Denver where the query program quadruple aim query, where they were planning to do process mapping throughout the study. So they had, I think, 27 or 23 process maps, consecutive process maps. So during the pandemic, we didn't have anything better to do, but we were sitting on Zoom calls with wonderful colleagues, and we would pull up a process map, and then we would look at the next process map, and we were looking for differences in the two, highlighted them as adaptations, and then we entered them in the database. So here you can see one, and then this is a consecutive, this is a dramatic change, but we identified which areas changed, and then we talked through why those changes happened. So this was one of those ways that we documented. I cannot tell you which combination of how many, etc., is the ideal. But I can tell you that we found that if we use only one technique, we would be missing some adaptations or detail about adaptations, because we, using multiple techniques, always seem to learn about more adaptations. So one technique might not capture all. And then also the level of richness of data that we get from the adaptations is bigger or better when we use multiple techniques. And so I always recommend choose as many as is feasible for your study, but choose multiple and think through, what you would lose with one or the other. The combination of those hopefully will give you a good picture, not everything, but close to everything. Questions, continue to be the devil in the detail. Who will collect this information? From whom? How frequently? All of those, I'm not going to tell you what is the right answer, should be decided on at the beginning. We have now put together mini protocols for adaptations, so we know how we are going to document it, who will document what. Sometimes you are just going to use research team all the way through because you don't want to burden your partner. Sometimes you actually engage partners in collecting adaptations. And sometimes you are actually just asking questions from these different individuals about adaptations. One thing that I didn't show is that we often send an email to a predetermined group. Often it's a research team, but sometimes implementers. Every other week we program it. And it's just a question, do you know of any change to the study? If so, email Valeska. She's one of our incredible implementation specialists. And basically, that's a way to keep an eye on it. The other thing that we often do is at the beginning of meetings, once a month or every other week, we start with the question, has anything changed? And then that can kind of lead to a quick documentation of adaptations. We also look at meeting notes. It used to be very time intense, but now we use AI to run transcripts for us, and then we can just basically read through those and look for any change that was discussed. So those are some ways that we have done it. The type of data that you collect will be also up to you. Most of the data that we collect is actually, I would say that it's kind of categorical data from a set of potential outcomes, except that the description of the adaptation will be kind of more qualitative in nature. These are some tiles, the kind of fields that we collect. It is emerging from a very complex framework frame. Many of you mentioned it actually or know about it, which was designed to document adaptations. Our team actually going back in time with Russ and Jody started to adopt this, and then our work further adopted this work with REAIM outcomes. So we have our own way of using frame. And then some of you also are familiar with the Frame IS, which was developed as a follow-up to Frame to focus on implementation strategies. And I would say, and this is something that we should not record, I should not say, but me thinking about this, I would not hold back from using Frame IS to document adaptations for evidence-based practices because it's a little bit more manageable. It has some core components and then some optional components. So it helps with different modules. And I think it works well. In a proposal, I think you will want to show that you understand that FrameIS was designed for implementation strategies. I think that that's the general understanding of reviewers, but it does capture EBPs. So it's kind of a little bit of a tension. What reviewers will be okay with, just do the right thing in your proposal, but know that this methodology is a little bit more accessible from my perspective. or use our method, and then you don't even have to come here. Okay, that was a joke, that very bad Hungarian joke. Moving on, key considerations for success in documenting adaptations. Lots of things listed here. I will mention just a couple. One, do something, in some ways capture them in a way that it's meaningful to your study. Think about multiple methods, but also multiple perspectives. We also found that when we ask different types of players, we hear about adaptations in a different way or about different adaptations. And then validation is critical. So when we collect the adaptations, we enter them in these forms. We do a lot of training and discussion of how we will use the categories. We also then go back to the team, validate whether the way that we describe them is correct. But definitely don't let perfect be the enemy of good, and don't try to do too much if that's not going to work for your study. One question that we constantly get is, what adaptation is too small to document? Like, what is the kind of the scope or size or nature where I should start to document? And I would say it depends. We use this kind of criteria I am showing on the top right blue box, that if the change had an impact on implementation or effectiveness outcomes, how the program is implemented in the current setting, or how it would be scaled, it's a good idea to document that. But I would say that in our studies, we also document changes to research processes because it's a good place to keep track of that. So if we change the recruitment technique, if we change our survey instruments, we put them in there so we can have a really nice listing of those changes. I think the idea of what is too small or too big, one example I like to say is that if you change a meeting time with your partners, is that an adaptation that you would want to document? And I would say it depends, because if you made that change just out of kind of convenience, etc., yes, perhaps not necessary. But what if you made that change because you learned something about a certain day that it doesn't work for them and you wanted to increase participation from the implementation partners? It becomes a little bit more interesting, isn't it? So I think it's just thinking through. We usually err on the side of documenting more and throwing out things later, but there is not a clear guidance on, this should be and this should not be implemented. Data analysis with adaptations often is not very different from what you do with other data. Often you do qualitative coding or some sort of descriptive tables. Many of the publications that, Jody, myself, others have showing adaptations will show the characteristics of the adaptations. There are some neat techniques that can be used, like configurational comparative methods. Jody is really, I don't know if she talked about that, but she has really good expertise, and many of you would be able to read her publications. Some colleagues use that to look at adaptations as well, but generally it's not super exciting at this point. We have started to think about the impact of adaptations, which is very tricky. Because often we make, when you have a study design where you specifically planned an adaptation, like the ones that you talked about with Jody before I came on, that's easier. But when you have a number of adaptations that happen and you just document them, but the design was not set up to powered for the impact, what do you do? How do you look at that change? So a few examples, we had colleagues here, actually, Anna Ma and others, who developed a very neat board within the each EHR system, looking at different REAM outcomes and their changes, and then they could link it to adaptations. And so that would be a great way to have quantitative information about adaptations. This is what I'm showing here is a subjective, like team-based assessment of impact of each adaptation and how they change different REAM outcomes. We have done it now in 4 studies. It's still painful, and I don't think this is the right way, but we are getting some sense of things. And so the recent publication by Brianna Reyes and other colleagues, we are showing some impact based on this methodology. It just came out, didn't put it in this deck. This is actually, I did put some in this deck. This is showing the changes to that different categories that we have, and then which one changed, no change, decreased, or increased as a result of adaptations. But the full paper is now cited on the left So I did a good job updating. Amazing. A framework that did not get picked up too much, but I thought was a really neat start was MEDI. So you might want to look it up. There was a website associated with it that went away. The lead author stepped out of academia, and so it didn't get evolved. But this has also some consideration for impact. And so it's a nice framework for that. And then you already talked about designs that might allow for actually planned adaptations. I think you talked about at least SMART. I don't know if you talked about most. Have you talked about Royo, Tina? Okay, so
No,
one
did
I
not.
will highlight, yeah, one I will highlight because it's new and we are right now struggling with data analysis on that, is this rollout implementation optimization design, which is basically, just to oversimplify, a stepped wedge design that allows for optimization of the intervention and the strategies after each rollout. So basically what you usually do when you do stepped wedge, but you don't say it to anyone because you are not supposed to change the intervention after each step wedge rollout. This one is acknowledging that there will be optimization and then allows for that. And JD Smith has some work on this, and our team has actually one of the first protocols describing the use of this. So very messy, of course, when you use it in the real world, but something that you can use. And then I'm super excited because a lot of the work that we put into thinking about documenting adaptations over time, we were able to summarize in this new annual review of public health publications. So a lot that I shared, you will find it there and in one place. And then there is a paper that I am even more excited about that is now in second review, well, re-review in implementation science, led by Kelly Ashbrenner, about the impact of adaptations and how to think about those. So look out for that. Hopefully it will be out soon. And then with that, I am just going to actually move to resources. I mentioned Freeman Freemias. Dr. Sturman has a beautiful web page providing additional coding guides, etc., for those frameworks. So take advantage of that. We had a special issue where we asked for publications that were assessing and guiding adaptations during implementation. So you can find a few examples there. And then we developed this annotated list. I'm not updating it anymore, but if you need the basic set of publications, this is a great place to go to get them. And then finally, I am so honored because in January 2016, Russ Glasgow and I started to host a group about adaptations, fidelity, and tailoring at the time as part of the VA. And then over time, we were not able to stay within the VA, so we moved outside, and then now we have colleagues from all over, including international participation. We host this every month, except for July and August. And we would be honored for you to come and join us. It's a very low-key group. And the next talk is going to be around human-centered design by Edmund Rumley. But we have a lineup for the rest of the year actually coming up here. So please email me and I'm happy to add you to this list. And I'm going to close. I don't know where I am in time. Tina will let me know.
5 minutes. You have 5 minutes.
Amazing. So I just wanted to close with this quote because I really find metaphors helpful in my life. And I mentioned architecture actually yesterday when I said that, think about TMFs as the architectural designs of your building, your home. Here is another architectural piece, and I am certainly not someone who has any talent in architecture. It's more of a accident that this happened this way. But let me kind of very briefly read this, and you can read to yourself as well. Implementing a program is like constructing a building. An architect draws upon general engineering principles, the theory, to design a building that will serve the purposes for which it is designed, so the functions. However, the specific building that results is strongly influenced by parameters of the building site, such as the lot size, the nature of the site's geological features, the composition of the soil, the incline of the surface, the stability and extremes of climate, zoning regulations, and cost of labor and materials. The architect must combine, that's you, architectural principles with site parameters to design a specific building for a specific purpose on a specific site, And this dynamic is mirrored, in this case, it says human services, but any kind of health services research or public health research, despite excellent plans and experience, ongoing redesign and adjustment may be necessary. So thank you so much, and I will stop sharing.
That was fabulous. There's a lot of questions in the chat. And I think Tina was going to ask you to try to answer them during the break. There's a couple questions specifically about Frame IS that I wondered if you wanted to speak to in our last few minutes here. So how does Frame IS kind of differ from Frame? You mentioned that it covers both the implementation strategies and the evidence-based practices. And how does that work?
Absolutely. So Frame was designed for evidence-based interventions, Frame IS with implementation strategies as a primary focus. That's the intent difference. The content is not that different. The only real big difference is, and I actually just did this comparison for our context and adaptation class, is the acknowledgement of implementation strategies in Frame IS and the acknowledgement of some outcomes. And that was not necessarily because it's unique to implementation strategies, just because the team evolved over time and added some additional features. So that's kind of the main difference, other than what I showed, that FrameIS identifies core modules and optional modules, which I would say, again, please do not share this broadly. There are only like 70 people here. I think that, what is optional and what is more recommended, you can make that decision with your team of what makes sense for you. But the notion that you can give permission to yourself, that not everything needs to be captured, I think that that's the spirit for me. So that's what I would make as a difference. And I will look for that table I created for our last class as well and drop it in the chat.
That would be great. Yeah, a reference though, the workbook that was sent around, I believe a number of the resources that Borshika shared today are in the workbook, so take a look there. And anything else before we go to break, Borshika?
I am just rereading Jennifer's comments. So what do I mean by, I didn't want to confuse people. What do you mean by also, FreeMIS also includes EBPs? When you read the top on the slide there, you will see that they mention implementation strategies, but they also highlight EBPs. So it doesn't preclude you from documenting adaptations for EBPs, but it also elevates the importance of documenting adaptations for implementation strategies. So it's almost like a combo, even though most people, most reviewers think about FreeMIS is for implementation strategies. I think that's not correct, but that's how some reviewers will see it, and they might think that you make a mistake if you use it purely for EBPs. That was my intended comment more pragmatically. So thank you. Nothing else. I will look at these questions.
Wonderful. All right, we're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we'll be back at 11:05 Mountain Time for Russ to talk about assessment and measures. So thanks to our morning presenters, and we'll see you back in 15 minutes.
Hey, Bethany, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm wondering what view I need to use. I've got my slides up, and I prefer to use one that if I can share a second, I'll show you. I don't know what it's called, but it's not the usual presenter mode. But the reason why is it's easier for me to manipulate my slides, and then I can also see chat. So can I try and show you what that view looks like?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Here I go and share that. Does this view work for you, or is that like too small or too distracting to use?
That's fine with me.
Okay, I think I'll use that then, because then I can still see chat, and I like to go back and forth with, other slides and optional things. So
Yeah.
if that works, that would make me a happy camper.
Yeah. I am not the Zoom police, so it's fine with me.
All right. Anything that's happened so far that I should know about or might help if I could work in or address from the morning sessions?
We had Jody presenting on study designs, and then Borshka presenting on the context and adaptations.
Right.
I think a couple themes that might have emerged are people really looking for resources on how to apply these methods, interested in opportunities for training, and then especially around cost. And so I'm not sure if you're planning to talk about cost outcomes at all. There's nothing else in the workshop that really gets into that. And so if you want to touch on that, maybe spend a little bit more time on that, I think that would be of interest to people. And then also seeing a couple comments related to things that are, distinguishing between quality improvement in implementation science. I'm not sure how directly relevant that is to what you're going to talk about, but thinking about, how to, tracking fidelity, sources for measuring fidelity and adaptations, if you get into that in your implementation outcomes, especially the fidelity outcomes.
Okay.
Does that help?
Helpful. That's good. That's good. I do plan to talk directly about cost, and I think fidelity will be easy to work in there. And I do have a fair amount on resources, but if it goes as plans, which it probably won't, 'cause, I run on and on, I tried to leave a fair amount of time for discussion. So hopefully you can join me in addressing some of those issues if we have time. And the other thing is, I like to stop partway through. So my plan is to stop and take some questions. It'll probably be about 2/3 of the way through, just so you have a heads up to do that. And then you and I can both watch the times. I think that'll be about 2/3 through, make sure I can get to the rest of the things, including costs. But I think that just works a little better, I think, for the audience too.
Sure, absolutely. People have been putting comments in the chat. We've been trying not to answer in the chat while you're speaking to avoid being a distraction. So if you start at 11:05 Mountain Time, do you want me to prompt you at 11:30?
How about 11:35? I worked this
11:35.
out to precise.
Okay,
To
that
see.
sounds good. I'll do that.
That'd be great. All right. I think I'm a happy camper. I'll be ready to share when we get back.
All right. See you back in about 10 minutes.
All right.
I'm so sorry, Bethany, will we be sharing the slides as well with the participants, the PDF of the slides or not?
Yeah, the slides will be shared, Borsika.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Very excited to welcome Dr. Russ Glasgow to talk about implementation outcomes and measures. So I'll turn it over to you, Russ, to share your slides and take it away. You're muted. You're muted, Russ.
Thank you. How about that? Does that look okay, the slides?
Not sharing slides yet.
Right. Try again. And how about now?
There you go. That looks great.
All right. Thank you. Hopefully we won't have too many more technical issues. Morning, everybody. Looking forward to meeting with you here. My plan, as you can see here, is to cover a fair number of things. I hope to power through the first section of things very rapidly and kind of tie back, particularly the focus that you've had on theories, models, and frameworks fairly quickly, then do a deeper dive into outcomes to pause a bit for discussion then. Again, I will go rapidly through here, but then have a little more time to talk about the remaining issues here. And I understand in particular adaptations, or excuse me, costs have come up a fair amount. And I know you just finished, I think, talking with Borsika about adaptations. A couple things by way of preview here, and I encourage you throughout to be thinking about a project of your own that you're applying here. It helps to get concrete, I think. One thing I want to stress here is that often when we think about assessment, we think about measures. And I really want to encourage you to think very broadly about different methods here. I'll come back to that, but I think we really need to get out of the box of thinking, we have to have a survey or even like a qualitative interview. Those are important. I think having some mixed and multiple methods is critical to almost all projects. But I think we also need to be, one way we can be innovative is to think about other things, particularly like issues like observations, in terms of cost or other areas. There's an increasing number of templates that we can use. Think we can use meeting methods with AI things now. We can use conversational analyses. And I just think that the richness and understanding is so much more if we can broaden our thinking away from the usual boxes that we put ourselves into in terms of assessment. So just a couple minutes on pragmatic research. Although not all D&I research is pragmatic, a good deal of it is, and as most of you know, here at Colorado and Accords, we focus a lot. That's kind of one thing we like to hang our hats on. So I'll say just a few words about that with the caveat that, maybe for some types of work you want to do or proposals, it doesn't have to be pragmatic. But the key features here in pragmatic research is that it works in the real world. It's feasible, real world settings, things that are relatively low burden, easy to administer. Now, exactly what be another level beyond that is the exact definition of pragmatic is open debate and has been over the years. And it's moderately easy to come up with a list of about 20 things that would make something pragmatic. It's harder, though, because to my knowledge, there's probably no measure or assessment that's 100% pragmatic, just like there's no design that's 100% pragmatic. And maybe it shouldn't be. But early on, I've been thinking a lot with colleagues about this for a long time. And we came up with a set of criteria, if I can count here, I think 9 key things that we thought were really important. And then we made a semi-arbitrary discussion or distinction of what we thought would be most important. I want to emphasize just a couple things. You can read these here. is to me, if an assessment, as it often is, not always, but if we're doing intervention research or outcomes research, I think one thing that's often ignored is the issue of, is a measure sensitive to change or responsive? It could also just be, if you're just doing a cross-sectional comparison, is it help show differential across those sites? Many really neat measures, and often a quick example or some quality of life measures, are really important measures of constructs, but they're really, really, really hard to change or insensitive to change. If I had to do this today, I'd probably switch a few of these, but in particular, this notion of being actionable, I think is really important, that I would move over to this other category. More recently, other colleagues have tried to integrate this with more traditional approaches, more standard psychometric things, which many of us have been trained in and are still important, but trying to integrate those with pragmatic approaches, and have a acronym as PAPERS that you can see here, have a series of publications, but they've done an expansion that I kind of like of these initial criteria or characteristics. And again, these are not definitive, but to give you a general notion, I like they make this distinction between subjective, which, is somewhat, as you can see, in the eye of the beholder here, and then more objective things. And I'll come back to some of these when I talk about a resource here, but I think that's just useful to keep in mind. Okay, now I'm going to do the rapid fire notion of hitting, at the risk of being slightly redundant, some key issues related to theories, models, and frameworks, and logic models, and how they set up what I really want to focus on for most of our time together in terms of assessment here. So you've seen this version. It's a one adaptation of Enola Proctor's classic model here. We're going to be focusing primarily today here on outcomes. I'll say a bit about all types, particularly implementation outcomes here. We also will talk about context, which is critical. But I think keeping this in mind, and I know some of you are meeting later to talk about fleshing out your own logic model here. This is, I think you've mentioned this before, but this is the most broadly, widely used one today by J.D. Smith and colleagues. But I myself want to emphasize, and we can talk about this if you want, that to me, this is a guide, just that rather than a mandatory requirement using exactly these boxes and that sort of thing. Myself, I think it's a very useful way to start thinking, but that you should modify and adapt, and maybe there's an additional column you want to add. Maybe there's some of the issues that aren't that critical that you might want to take out. This is a slightly different logic model, and I'll come back to that because, as I mentioned here, it's used as part of the website that I know Borsika has talked with you about here. And I'm going to focus on one section of that that's on assessment. But this is the logic model that's used there. And the way it's used, it's a fillable PDF that you can do with some examples of doing it. But then it guides you based on the constructs that you have in each of these boxes that you put here to particular both theories and frameworks and also assessments that you might want to use. So I'll just, full disclosure, Borsika and I have been involved in pushing this as well as some other people, but the primary ones. So there's at least a reasonable conflict of interest there. Okay, so let's get to kind of the very rapid setup to go through some of these issues about theories, models, and frameworks, and then get to the heart of this. But implementation outcomes is going to be our key focus, and I think that they're important for a whole variety of reasons, including how successful your implementation has been, to understand the processes and or the mechanisms through which that happens. And then often I think this notion that's left out of much traditional health outcomes or health services research is these are important intermediate outcomes that are more proximal, that really drive or determine your other particularly your patient or clinical outcomes. And so I think it's so critical. One of the complexities we'll come back to this type of research is that there are a lot of interactions among different outcomes and measures there. Above all, this is probably a bit of a broken record, but it's really important takeaway for you is all assessments should be guided by either your framework or I myself feel that you can have a really strong logic model and guide with that, but you need to use that throughout and kind of tie back to that. These, I will just go through some of the dominant frameworks that I know you've been talked about. Certainly not applicable to every particular thing you do, but I will note that CFIR in its CFIR 2.0 here does have a specific set of implementation outcomes there that was a new adaptation, and you might want to look at those. The most widely used approaches to looking at outcomes in implementation science have been either the Proctor framework that we call, and a number of other colleagues too. People focus on ENOLA for reasonable reasons, and or REAIM. And this was just a quick crosswalk that Tina did. I stole from her, but it shows how similarities here, and it's also true of CFIR 2.0. If we look at that, there's a lot of similarities, but there are some slight differences. And one thing I'd like to point out here is the things in italics here that are increasingly widely used, particularly because of the neat pragmatic measure Brian Weiner and colleagues have developed of looking at a brief, I think it's 4 items, assessment of accessibility, appropriateness, and feasibility. And people often ask, how does that map into REAIM? And the answer is, well, it doesn't 100%, but these things really drive, or I like to think about these as prerequisites, or maybe that's a bit strong, at least strong predictors of later what I call actual implementation outcomes. So these are like estimates that people can do, but when you're actually doing it, like it asks about acceptability, that's an estimate that you can do that drives adaptation, or excuse me, that drives adoption here. Similarly, feasibility, okay, is really probably one of the dominant factors that drives implementation. So just that crosswalk is a frequent question we get. I've heard that people want a lot of resources, understandably. That's great. Fortunately, for many of assessments that are aligned with one of these major frameworks, including a few other things like normalization process, I did add it. I didn't have it before yesterday, but these all have really nice compendiums, I think, of measurement options associated if you choose, but I don't want you to be restricted to those theories. I would like to do a bit of a deep dive and take a few minutes talking about, again, with acknowledgement that I'm biased here, this website here that you've heard talked about using to plan, select, consider combining different frameworks, adapting them, using them. But now I want to focus on assessment issues here. And this is a relatively strongly revised. There was an old section that then became out of date because the websites it in turn sent people to were kind of out of date or no longer available. So we've done a huge over the last 18 months, a huge reframe on this. And I know Borsica's talked in general, but I want to tell you more about the assessment section because we think that is currently one of the best single resources that you can use to find out about D&I assessment instruments. This is what it looks like here, and you have different ways that you can navigate it. Caveat is very much a work in progress, so we would love, either Borsica or myself, love feedback that you have on this, what's working and isn't working, how well it meets your needs. But as you can see, we have different ways that you can get into this. we can have some particular guidance here that focuses on characteristics. And we have a number of different characteristics. By that, we mean things like what are the constructs assessed? What implementation outcomes do they look at? What's the cost and the time involved in that assessment? We try to provide, whenever possible, an actual copy of whatever the scale or the template or interview guides that we have in here. Our assessment of how much interpretation is needed or training to interpret it. If it's a paper and pencil measure, the literacy level, things like what language is it available in, what guidance is there both for interpretation and administration. We have a total of 38 characteristics, and to date, there are 50, I think 52 assessments in here. We hope within a month or so there'll be at least 60, and we've tried to pick things related both to the most widely used theories, but also issues. Going back to think about your implementation logic model, we've tried to talk about the things that we know that are both currently the most widely used and in our subjective estimate, the best. But it's an ongoing basis. We would love to get more feedback or suggestions, either just your suggestions for a type of measure you would like, and then ideally, if you have a measure, either that you've developed or you know a lot about, we would love to hear about that to add in here. I will say the one caveat is it takes a fair amount of time to do coding, objective coding of these different characteristics, these 38 characteristics that we can provide feedback on. So we'll be able to incorporate it a lot sooner if, in fact, you can help us answer at least some of these 38 questions that we have here. But we've made an emphasis in here, again, tried to push the envelope a bit. So we went beyond survey measures, and even we tried to have a number of interview guides, which I think are important, but going beyond that too, to have some things like observations. We have a moderate amount on cost and some templates to collect that. Over time, we're going to have more things on conversation analysis and systems, rapid qual approaches to do things. One caveat I will mention is we have made a decision that these measures are, if you will, at the implementation level, measures of like what do the staff do, what are setting characteristics and things. These are not individual level. So if you're looking at like measures of patient measures, what is a patient's self-efficacy level, or what is their belief about health beliefs, those aren't in here, at least currently, but it's this higher level of implementation. So I'm going to pause here in maybe about 10 minutes, and I'd be glad to answer any more questions about this, but it is something that both we'd like your feedback on, but we hope is fairly useful now and be even more useful in the future. So the rest of the talk, here are, I think, when we think about D&I models, measures, and frameworks, some key issues that we'll drill down on. Context, outcomes, mechanisms, although I won't say a huge amount about this, but we can have a fair amount more discussion. Thinking about moderators and covariates, and often that's a big issue in implementation science because we do attempt to do a lot, and the world is complex, and many things. One of my favorite phrases is it depends. And these are issues that often drive what it depends on. But ultimately, again, you can think about, again, the models or frameworks, we went back there. These issues and your choices in each of these areas should be driven by your logic model or your framework that you have there. So with the caveat that I am not a qualitative researcher, I do want to drive home the importance of having qualitative and at least multiple, if not mixed methods that you integrate together there. And again, I think as a field and as individuals, we need to think more broadly than we have in the past. I like to say one thing, qualitative research is more than focus groups, which is often what people default to. Not that they don't have their place, but every single measure has pros and cons. But in particular, I want to make a big push for you to use mix different things. A particular reason to use qualitative measures is to help us understand how results come about. Often our quantitative measures focus on what happened, okay, and the level of response or whatever, but not nearly as much on how results come about. In terms of analyzing your qualitative results, you have both methods and then you have a number of different strategies for analyzing those there. And an increasingly popular approach, particularly with pragmatic research, and particularly when you want to use initial results to help inform what you're doing during a project in an iterative type phase, there's a clear emphasis here on rapid qual has kind of exploded. Allison Hamilton, Larry Palinkas and group have been one of the biggest proponents of this and the earliest folks that have nice models, but there are a number of other, and I will just note that there's also, I think, within the last year, been an explosion of use of AI, different AI systems to do some rapid qual of notes or observations or focus group meetings that you have. What I'd like to do is give you, now I've been talking in generalities. As most of you know, I and our group make a lot of use of re-aim. So I'd like to give you an example now applying and operationalizing some of these issues in, I think, the next 4 or 5 slides. And then I'd like to pause and have some discussion of issues that have come up to date. So as I think many of you know, re-aim is an acronym for Reach, Effectiveness, Adoption, Implementation, and Maintenance. And I just want to go over some of the key issues here and also suggest this is a type of table that you'd probably want to modify a little bit, but that can frequently be helpful in grant proposals. Instead of technical, you might want to put exactly how you're operationalizing it or defining it. And then rather than recommendations here, just report the kind of the details that you're doing. You may also want to have a column here to talk about how frequently or what time points you're assessing it. But I want to point out here both not only the general issue here for outcomes, which I'd like you to be thinking about at that level, but also what are some of the key issues or details, and especially I'm going to focus on things that are often left out and that are sometimes Achilles heels if you have a real hardcore reviewer that are going to look at it. So in terms of reach, and underneath each, I've given both the technical definition and then here a more pragmatic definition when we talk with clinical groups that aren't researchers or even community groups or something, we use a who, what, why approach. And I think often we can even get away with the terms, or if we want to use them to focus on this to communicate. But one thing that's often left out here is the representativeness, or dare I say equity, of results that you see across that in terms of who's participating. Most everybody gets the number, and most people get the proportion here. And you're comparing a numerator to denominator, but often this issue of how representative are those that take part is left out. Individual level, I think here is a somewhat more straightforward and more traditional health outcomes, although I like to emphasize a focus on heterogeneity here and also kind of breadth of outcomes, somewhat in contrast to usual directions to just focus on a primary outcome. I think the generalizable effect, because I think a lot from a systems perspective, sometimes you can have a great outcome on your intended thing, but it can have a lot of unintended iatrogenic effects, negative effects here. So I think thinking broadly is important on that effectiveness outcome. Adoption, I do want to emphasize, first of all, somewhat arbitrarily, but adoption is at the level of staff or settings here, okay? Or it is also multi-level. So it can also be at a whole healthcare system or at a community level. And often there are different, these are kind of sequential or hierarchical housed within those. But this, in particular, I think the most relevant is the staff or the implementer, delivery staff, but then often the setting, like a clinic. For many of you that work in healthcare systems, what's the clinic that there are important to understand? Adoption has many of the same features, almost identical, that REACH did. If I go back to REACH, if you look here, including representativeness that I want to push there. But often adoption is left out in terms of where do you get. You talk about the number, like I have 13 clinics, but 13 out of how many that you approached, how many could have been involved is really important. And again, this notion of representativeness. One of the areas that has changed, REAIM has changed a fair amount, as noted here. Well, that isn't it. I don't know if I have another one. I think others have referred today to this paper here, what we call the 20-year paper, how REAIM has evolved over time. But the implementation feature is the thing that has changed the most. And what I want to talk about in it, if you're going to do a thorough job of talking about implementation in REAIM in 2025, you talk about three things. One, an original thing was what I like to call consistency of delivery or fidelity that is involved. And I want to stress that and I think Borsika has done a nice job, has to be balanced with adaptation. So under REAIM, you do report on fidelity consistently. Often this can be checklist. I think some of the neat measures when you can are observational measures of delivery. But also importantly, adaptations that you've talked, I think Borska just got done before break at that, and I'm going to say a few more words. Cost, I think, are a big, often left out, but critically important. And again, I'm going to talk more about here after we have a bit of a discussion. And again, then the notion of how do these things come about, which is important for all of them. But I want to stress these three components are all important under implementation. And then finally, I'll just say here that maintenance in REAIM anyway has both the individual level, so that's what your client or what's your participant outcome, your long-term outcome there, and then particularly from an implementation science perspective in the setting, how long was the intervention delivery sustained? We could have a whole, maybe next year, we'll get your feedback. We'll maybe have at least a talk, if not a whole theme on sustainment, which is one of the hottest areas and up till the last 2 years, I'd say most neglected areas. But I will mention just one thing that we can talk about in a minute or two if you want to, is often your time frame just doesn't allow you to look at, well, like what happens in my setting a year or 2 years, which ideally I think for sustainment you want. Often that just doesn't work, at least in that study. You might want to put it in your next one, but you can almost always assess intent to sustain. And then a caveat here is, at least in my experience, even if you have great results, even if you show they're cost effective, doing this, many settings, very few settings are going to be able to continue or to sustain it in exactly the way it was during your implementation or your study. But they're often interested in thinking, how can they adapt it? Again, to make it more feasible so that they can go do it with their resources and their setting, their workflow, their population over time. So I think that's a strong area, both for future research to get down some really good assessments, but also a way that you can address. Often people automatically reject maintenance, say, I just can't do that. It's not relevant. So just one way of putting this together here, looking at a table here putting together quant and qual, something else you might want to think about for regardless of whether it's reaim or something else for your proposals. And the key questions here are what happened, okay? And then why did it happen or how did it happen over here? So a thought question for you, and then we'll take a break right about where I wanted to be and have a little discussion. I think maybe we can have like up to 5 minutes discussion. Bethany, if you can help me modulate here, but this is kind of for me the big picture question of what I think science is about. I'll let you read that, but it's a lot about these issues of what, why, where, when. And I do want to say the caveat, this is kind of for me a guiding light or North Star that we want to get towards. But usually it's not possible to address all of these questions in a given study. But I think if we want to think about what really advances the field or we want to move towards, to think about at least considering these when you're doing your study, which of these can you address, what's within scope, and what's most important given what's known and not known, and to think about how can you address those and then focus on assessing and reporting those features here that are the most relevant. We will come back here to talk a fair amount about issues about resources used and the populations. And I can't believe we have 12 different versions of this, but as I'm reading it to myself, I don't think I talked about settings or context. My apologies. Should definitely say in what context there. So with that, let me pause and at least we can have a brief discussion here before we finish up.
Thank you, Russ. So we do have about 13 more minutes in this session. So if anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. There's just a couple here. Russ, we have a question on assessing implementation. How critical are clinician workforce competencies and implementation principles in success of an initiative? And then is there a national standard for clinician competencies in implementation science? We do have the researcher competencies. I linked those in the chat there. But can you speak about clinician competencies?
It's a great question. Not to my knowledge, and I think that those would be pretty specific to what the area, what the clinical or the public health focus is to do that. I don't know of any standard ones. Usually, I think there is some level of training required, and then that can be specific. And then that usually gets into fidelity, I think is the way to do it, is can they deliver something that's key, but that usually is somewhat specific to areas. The best single resource I can think of, I don't think this is a generalizable thing, is I happen to have it in front of me here. I don't know if you can see this or not, but it's a great, relatively recent book by Brian Weiner and colleagues here called Practical Implementation Science. It's one of the books that's referenced there, but it does focus on, this is for implementers as well as scientists, and each of the chapters there, I think, would address some of the key issues that are involved.
Can you hold it up again, Russ?
Yep. Practical Implementation Science by Brian Weiner, Kara Lewis, I shouldn't neglect them, and Kenny Starr, who are all three luminaries within the field.
That's great. And I do think that raises the issue of what's the difference between implementation science and implementation practice.
Mm-hmm.
Could you maybe comment on that a bit?
I can, and welcome you two also within our limited time here. To me, the focus that we've had so far is developing the science or the research practically, and then we've done training and things, but I think there hasn't been enough focus or certainly training programs to my knowledge. Like public health has a whole system of training MPH people to go out and do community-based interventions and CBR things. But we haven't had enough about training people how to do, so you know the basic concepts and understanding a framework and maybe the outcomes you need to look at, but you don't need to be a scientist or know the latest research and things like that. That's what this book is about. There've been some discussion here on campus and things about trying to develop more of a focus for the implementer, the delivery person, to be informed about it. So it's an important need. We try to address that somewhat in our certificate course, and I don't know if Tina's on now. I can't quite see who's there, but it's sometimes a little challenging to try and address both, but we're trying to be sensitive to that. But it's a great question.
I am
Um,
here, but I
more.
put in the, oops, sorry, I am here, but I put in the chat a resource that's really focused on practitioners a lot more. Like the title of our workshop focuses on research because that's really where most of our expertise is. But there are training programs and a certification program for implementers or practitioners at the Center for Implementation.
Great. That is a wonderful resource. Thanks for bringing that up. And you might want to put in chat. I know we're trying to minimize it, but Julia Moore's group, the Center for Implementation, are just an incredible resource about translating the jargon that people like me talk about and things into something that people can use in the real world. And it's called the Center for Implementation. They also, I know you've wanted to talk about training, but provide wonderful training. And we have sent some of the people that work like research assistants and things like that to get trained there. I just really think their work is top notch, and maybe somebody can put in their
Tina
website.
did. Yeah, Tina put that in the chat, which is great.
Perfect. Okay, I should probably get back to now so we get a chance to get through this and then save time for a few more questions, because I know the clock is ticking here. So other
You
important
need to
issues.
share your screen again, Russ. I stopped the sharing so we could see the video. So you'll have to
Thank
reshare
you.
again.
Thank you. I could have gone on and on there. Am I sharing now?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, here we go. So here's what's left. I'm going to say a bit about this, and I don't know, I think we've maybe talked some, but not a huge amount about context. Is that correct? I'm looking at Bethany and Tina.
Yes.
Some, but not a lot.
Yeah,
And then
Borsica.
cost I want to focus on, because I know we haven't done that. Just a couple things about adaptation, as I know we've talked a lot about those, but they're critical. If you don't leave with, that's one of the key take-home messages here, we've failed. So context, some people have said context is everything, okay, outside of the maybe the intervention itself. But I liked this definition or framework, that to think about the places in which people live, work, and play, but it's the context and other issues around that. As you'll see on the next slide, context is not just the setting. That's an important part of it, but it's broader than that. It's also multi-level, and then critically, as popularized by David Chambers and colleagues in the dynamic sustainability framework, it changes a lot and our world today. And I think we need to be able to adapt to that. It isn't enough just to assess context at baseline. There are different approaches. I love actually some of the more European approaches to it, a little more than what we're doing in the US. Here's a key reference here on the CC approach there. But this is another take home, that context is more than setting. It is almost impossible to assess all aspects of context, so you need to make some choices based on your theory or whatever there. And then again, the notion that you have talked about, and part of the art that we need great practitioners here, is how to align what we're doing, both our interventions and our implementation strategies, with context. Just quickly, since many of you use, and this is a common confusion today, that we've not been successful at communicating to people, but PRISM is not different than REAIM. PRISM is an expansion, and it includes REAIM. And if I could see you in person, I'd do a little exercise about having you all repeat after me to do that. But PRISM includes, it expands a focus on context to REAIM. This is a logic model version of PRISM that not as many people are familiar with. It's part of the iterative web tool, PRISM web tool that we have there that's a reference. But now I want to spend maybe the rest of our time on cost. So we can have a question or two, maybe just one. But cost is so vital, and I think it's been ignored for a lot of reasons. Part of it is people think it's overly complex or that you need a world-class complete economic analysis and you can't afford that or you don't have access to an economist, at least that works in the type of thing that we do. This is changing rapidly, and a couple reasons why, but I will tell you in terms of resources, again, Truth in Advertising, this is something we've developed, but this is what we call a costing guidebook that you can do. I think this resource was developed with health economists, but where you don't need, unless you're going to a full-blown something like cost benefit or cost effectiveness or simulation modeling thing, I don't think you need to necessarily have an economist, or if you do, maybe just initial consult with them. But why? I just want to make a big push here about why do we do that? Maybe the bottom line, you can read some of this, is from an implementation perspective. In my experience, this is often after you do a study and then you want to go to new places to disseminate this. This is often the key question that they're going to want to ask, is even more than what your results are, they're going to want to know, could I possibly do this? They're going to ask, well, what does it cost? And more than that, they're going to want to know, what will it cost them? It's one important issue, what did it cost you in your research? But more relevant to them than that is, what's it going to cost them with their staffing, with their setup to do that? And so there's been a big focus, well, not a big, but we think it's important to talk about what are called replication costs. And then from a science perspective, cost is a key determinant of many things, but particularly of sustainment and then of adoption or dissemination. The guidebook that I mentioned before, and you'll have these slides there, has templates, a lot of guidance and concern about details about how to do that, some templates. But this is just an example of one of Tina's studies here, show how you can report. Often for many of what we're doing, it's really time that we're talking about is the predominant, not the only thing, but the key thing we're looking at. And if we just track time, that will get us a long ways towards we want, and then you can turn this into actual cost. And I think I'm gonna stop there because you've covered some of these things. I'll leave you with just saying, really, really important, I think, to think about multiple methods and ways to assess. You want to take a minute or two? I can stop sharing here, and I don't know. We have another minute or two, or where we're at time-wise.
We have 2 minutes. So there's a couple other questions here. So can you speak to defining and measuring implementation outcomes in a small feasibility study preparing for a future full implementation trial?
I can. I think at minimum, you can do something like, I encourage you to think more broadly than only using it, but I mentioned before these measures of feasibility, acceptability, and appropriateness. I don't know if you need all of them that Brian Weiners and colleagues have done. Maybe somebody can put that into chat. But I think we can always get at least an estimate, or sometimes there are other ways to do that of things you want to do. So after you're developing with your partners a plan for your intervention, your implementation strategy, to ask them, how can you go about, or what do you think your best estimate is this would work in your setting? One that we're pushing a little bit more now that I think is pragmatic is this iterative PRISM assessment tool that Katie Trinkley led us in developing. but it asks a series of 21 questions, which can be used throughout your project, but also at a planning phase. I think is useful and fairly pragmatic. People can do that. Also, it's web-based offline, and then talk about your cumulative results.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Russ. Excellent as always. So grateful to have you here to present.
Great interacting and talking with people, and thanks for letting me be part of this exercise.
Absolutely. I think we're going to move into our final session with Dr. Perez Yales talking about partner engagement. I'll turn it over to you, Monica.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon for those who are not on Mountain Time. Thank you, Bethany. All right. So for the next, I will say 45 minutes, let me share some highlights about engagement in general, but also in the context of implementation science. I put together also some resources for you all, and feel free to ask questions as I share the slides. And also others, please feel free to chime in. I'm not the only individual or researcher in this room that has strived to have meaningful partnerships and that work in this space as an area of interest. So there are other experts in the room as well, and I would love to hear from your experiences. All right, engaging your partners. Let me share my screen. I have put together again kind of a tour of a few areas. Let me take it off the presenter view. All right. For some reason, you still can see let me try one more time. So you can see the full slide. Okay, I think now I'll get it. All right. Are we good?
Yes.
Tina, can you see?
Yep,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah.
All right. I know I'm preaching to the choir. Many of you are actually interested in engagement, interested in implementation science, because we strive to do this with our partners. But I always like to start here. We just have such a much better science and really products and outcomes when we include our partners. Our outcomes matter, and our solutions can be better sustained, among other benefits of including our partners in implementation science and in any aspect of research. So I always start about this question, what is the difference? Is there a difference on how we engage with partners in general for research, perhaps in other areas, and in implementation science? I think there are some areas that are slightly different, although most of it is quite overlapping. But let me share my point on the areas that are very suitable for implementation science and what that means for engagement with our partners. First, I like to define what I'm talking about. There are many ways of defining engagement. I am using PCORI's 2022 definition. I would like to acknowledge that I prefer the term partners instead of stakeholders, but this is not my definitions. But one way of defining what do you mean by engagement is that, and quite often there's confusion, that I interact or I invite patients, community members, perhaps healthcare professionals, payers, to be part of the research process, including implementation, as partners, as collaborators, as advisors. It is not really as study participants, where I am doing interviews and I am then recruiting caregivers to provide one-time interview, for example, or do focus groups, and they receive an incentive. That is different than this area of emphasis and work in terms of engagement of our partners as partners. I was trying to avoid saying it twice. But I like this definition for that reason. To make that distinction is always confusing. And the idea is, yeah, what the benefits that I mentioned there. All right. So let me highlight again a few areas you may agree or not on what does it mean engagement in the field of implementation science. Let's start with asking key questions in terms of engagement in this field. These are very helpful questions for you to ask yourself and with your team early on. Why, who, and in what ways, how, and when should I engage our partners? How do we assess, let me put this here, that our partnership is working or that we're heading to the direction that we want to head? So this speaks on evaluating the partnership, the engagement, which often it is not evaluated, although recently, I will say in recent years, we have been increasing our efforts to formally assess the partner engagement. And I also provide some examples of partner engagement. Additional questions, how do I engage? And that's linked to my goals for the project, my resources, my timeline perhaps. And how do I know that we have been successful in engaging our partners? So I just wanted to include a few questions that can prompt the planning of your engagement activities early on. Next is sharing and highlighting frameworks. As you know, we do love frameworks, of course, in D&I, but there are also general frameworks. We do have one on engagement and health equity for implementation science, but I wanted to share this one, the dynamic relationship, that also includes health equity, systems, transformation. You can see, yes, Aguilar Gaxiola, the citation is there. But I wanted to highlight how at the center of systems transformation and health equity is engagement. And you can see here some core principles from this framework on what does it mean to engage with our partners, especially in a meaningful way. So now notice the very heavy emphasis on all things co-equal, co-created, is ongoing, shared governance, multi-knowledge. So I really like this framework because it really centers how we interact with our partners during implementation science research in a way that is very involved, that is very collaborative, as a way of transforming different systems and communities and improving health and healthcare, public health, clinical care, and service delivery. Then my next point to highlight, what does it mean to engage our partners in this field of implementation science, is, as you may have heard throughout the sessions yesterday and today, and in general, that for this field, for D&I field, understanding context is of utmost importance because one of our goals is to really understand those local contexts and align our interventions and the implementation plan to the characteristics of those local systems, communities, or contexts. That's how we identify fidelity, but especially also adaptations to really honor and acknowledge differences and richness of the different systems. And this could be a neighborhood, it could be a community, it could be a hospital. So that means that what I'm arguing, and hopefully you will agree and others, is that in order for us to reach this goal in our field, we really, that means that we really need to include our partners in a way that is going to allow us to understand those contexts. So the type of engagement for your projects in research, for example, D&I, really needs to align with this goal. And that means one approach is not the only one, is if you think of engagement as a continuum, and there are several models or tables that shows this continuum. This is one from the International IAP2, and I always forget the acronym. So if you remember, probably Bethany knows it, or others, if you don't mind putting in the chat, but the link is there. So from this approach, we think of engaging our partners in terms of their roles in different ways. If you look at the left, hopefully it's your same left as mine, that area is when our partners are serving a role or working with us more as advisors and giving us advice or informing us, perhaps as consultants. But if you go to the right of the continuum, our partners have a more involved role. They are part of co-decision making, they're part of governance. So it's a really collaborative approach that, again, I linked it to our need to really understand the nuances, characteristics, needs, priorities, and history of those local contexts where we are innovating or implementing something new. Ideally, we want to empower our partners to even have more ownership in the research process. I think we're heading there. I think we continue to strive, but I'm not sure we are there or at all or always. So again, my current point is that in our field, I see of great importance to implement or use a type of engagement that can get us to the right of that continuum. This is another model for continuum of engagement. You may have seen it. It's called 2021 Spectrum of Community Engagement to Ownership, and it was developed by community members. So not as much as researchers or public health, public services individuals, but more by community members. And I have included here the link. I will encourage you to take a look at this very interesting online short document. What I wanted to highlight is that they also see engagement in terms of phases, but they from this approach, the phases should be getting us to number 5, that at some point we defer to communities to align or prioritize outcomes, to partner with us to identify and prioritize needs that we should research. But look at number 4 is the emphasis on collaborations. There's a little bit more on what it means from this framework. Notice on the left, 0 and 1, number 1, how from community perspective, when we deny access to decision-making processes, they can be perceived as ignoring their own ownership and ability to be at the table and be part of decisions with us as researchers, placation in terms of informing, provide the community with relevant information. We will keep you informed, but we are going to go here and do our thing. So again, it doesn't mean that we're doing that. It's just how communities may perceive the type of role that they are invited to at the table when we partner with them. So keep that in mind from community's perspective. I think this continuum is helpful to help us think that way. Again, I constantly ask myself and with others these questions. This sounds great, but how do we know? How do we know that we have an active type of engagement with partners, especially since we have differences in knowledge? As a researcher, I acknowledge the power that I have in terms of funding and allocating funding to different things and being able to start a project after I receive funding. As well as the fact that quite often, again, I see a lot of improvement. We continue to strive to provide a science on how we engage with each other, but there's still a black box where we mention we engage with our partners and we co-created, and here are the results of our study. So it's still kind of a black box, and I encourage us to continue approaching engagement with a lot of detailed planning, systematic approach, evidence-informed methods, reporting, and sharing with others. It is not easy. This is a quote from 2017. I think it still applies. It has been hard to measure and to really understand and replicate when we're successful in terms of partner engagement for many reasons. So let me share some resources with all of you to hopefully increase, expand the toolkit that you have on how to engage with your partners. I recommend, if you're not familiar with some of these, to take a look and look around these very helpful resources. I have updated them with some of the latest tools, especially from Picori. So one is from our colleague Bethany Kwan, the DICE methods. There is a methods navigator, and here is the link, dicemethods.org. It has been updated recently, but it's a great source where you can identify your needs for partner engagement. How much time do you have? How much funding do you have? And then you enter some information, and it will give you, as you see on the left, different suggestions for the type of activities or engagement approaches or methods that you may consider, such as appreciative inquiry, such as community engagement studios, concept mapping, Delphi techniques. So it's a tool. It's not a perfect recipe, but it just gives you a little bit of ideas, and then you can click and learn more from those methods. So number one resource, if you're not familiar, the dicemethods.org. There is another source in terms of consumer voice that was developed by colleagues. Oh my gosh, I should have put the team that developed here in implementation science, and you can see how to use consumer voice, prepare to work with consumers. But they developed these different modules in simple Google folders that you can log in and identify different aspects of consumer voice and participation. All right. Let me keep going. I have a lot of tools and show and tell in 40 minutes, so I know it's a lot. If you want to stop me or ask questions, feel free. Tool number 3 that I wanted to share with you is PCORnet Engagement Committee Assessment Tool. It provides very helpful tables in terms of the elements of engagement, for example, that we know matter, such as collaborative and respectful leadership. What are the key steps to achieve that? Some processes and resources. And what I really like from this resource in some of the tables is that it provides us with some ideas on how to monitor and how to evaluate, how to assess that in fact we are achieving a particular element or aspect of engagement. So very helpful tools. Take a look. PCORnet is a series of networks funded by Patient-Centered Outcomes Institute or PCORI, and they provide a lot of resources for us in terms of engagement. There is a CDC. I failed to check. I'm not sure this is no longer, if it's still available. It might not be available, but the CDC has, I hope, maybe had a great partnership assessment tool. I should have checked if it's available, so I'm not sure, given all the transitions with federal changes. All right. One of the latest resources that I wanted to share is coming from PCORI, Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And it's called from the Foundational Expectations for Partnership in Research. What I really like from this site is that, in my view, it's easier to navigate. You can see the link there at the bottom. If you scroll a little bit down, you can find these buttons. And in my view, very important key aspects of helping us guide our engagement efforts. They highlight how important it is to have representation, and maybe Ross or others talk about reach and having a representative type of reach, for example, but thinking also in terms of engagement and involvement. So if you click on the button, it's going to give you more definitions. I like that, but also resources and tools. If you want to explore and kind of really think of how do I make sure that I have an involvement that is representative of the community or communities that matter for this project. The second area that they highlight, and I completely agree, and we have heard from partners in our project, is early and ongoing engagement. Another key area where you can learn more. Quite often, in my experience, I hear from partners, patients, community leaders, and others, nonprofit or patient advocacy organizations. Please don't invite us when you have made all the decisions. When you just want to hear advice from us, it's incredibly helpful. But again, in my experience, what I have heard is if you're going to include us actively, it really needs to be as early as possible. And that could be when you're developing an idea, when you are working on a grant proposal and you're developing the plan, when you just got funded, and you're just getting started. Ideally, the earliest that you can involve partners in different ways, listening sessions, some of these studios, community studios to just kind of brainstorm some ideas is incredibly helpful for our partners to be part of that process early on. Number 3, funding. And that, as you know, funding helps things happen. So for us to plan our budgets in grant proposals, evaluation projects, or even in practice at your hospital, clinic, and schools is incredibly helpful. So our partners receive fair payment for their time, their expertise. From this view, is as valued as the expertise from clinicians, for example, as users of healthcare services, as those who navigate the system, and as those who are impacted by the problems, gaps, and solutions we're seeking the communities we care about. Number 4, build capacity. And this is incredibly helpful. We often don't see it. We just kind of meet and we have an agenda and we move forward. But there is a lot of training and reading on group dynamics. It's often called meso level. So it's not individual, not the big systems, but in the middle. How do we manage the dynamics of groups? How can I be better at facilitating those groups dynamics, at solving conflict? A whole section on this. How do we increase our capacity to work as a team? There's actually a science, it's called team-based science, and whole fields, Harvard has a whole field of studying teams and how do we make teams cohesive? How do we deal with power differentials on teams? But another area of training for you to consider, number 5, meaningful involvement. So PCORI really picked this up. You may have heard this word, meaningful involvement, as so important, but what will that mean? There's a lot of lack of concrete resources and even definition of what will that mean to have a meaningful inclusion. Take a look at what PCORI came up with and how they're linking that to decision making. And the last one, heavy emphasis now, as I mentioned, on assessment of engagement, the same way we assess other areas of research and even outcomes. Brand new, as I mentioned, this came mid to late last year, 2024. Next, I wanted to highlight another key area in implementation science, and that is how to identify partners for my project or for your project. There are different ways. There's no one a single way. It really depends on your training, your goals, your timing, again, your research questions. But I wanted to highlight, I like this team have come up with the 7 Ps framework to identify partners in patient-centered outcomes research. The citation is there, and they provide a table where they really divide the different groups of potential partners and who they are, and the examples of type of partners, patients and the public. Those could be population-focused public health, caregivers, family, and look, consumer advocacy organizations. We currently have several of these amazing partners nationwide in a PCORI-funded project on the science of engagement. Who are the providers with some examples, purchasers, payers, policymakers. So take a look at this publication. It's very helpful, and I like the 7 Ps, and you can even create your own table. We have done some of these in some of the trainings where you can create your own table with the categories, description, and what do you need for your project, and you can still even develop this table with your partners. An aspect that I wanted to mention that I have presented before is keep in mind that the groups that you may need for your project, it might be some of these 7 groups or a few, that the type of group that you may see as needed, and then the type of engagement and how to do engagement, in my view, is context dependent. keep in mind the context for your patients and communities, because it shapes the history of the context, the characteristics, the resources. Again, going back to my initial point, especially for implementation science, it really shapes the type of engagement in terms of need, what they bring to the table, their expectations, power dynamics. So I will add from Kankanon and others, if I pronounce the name correctly, that this table is incredibly helpful. Please keep in mind that how we interact with each other is also context dependent. We cannot take our history, who we are, our experiences out of the table. That's where implementation science frameworks are amazing to help us guide on how do we do this and how to think of the context. PRISM is a context-based framework that you may consider, and also EPIS, developed by Greg Arons and others. But this is how we continue this priority of context on everything we do in implementation science and in research in general. Keeping track of the time. I wanted to also highlight, besides engagement being who do you bring to the table and why are you bringing them, and please define what you mean by policymakers and what is the context for our project, for who we are, for where we are located. Also keep in mind equity issues in terms of engagement. Here are just some highlights and a publication you might find helpful. Tools to improve reporting of patient and public engagement in research, and they offer a checklist. I have highlighted here a few, given the time. There's no way I can share all the tips or things I have found helpful, but I highlighted several that have been very helpful. And one is make sure you include underrepresented groups of partners at the table, but include them in higher level decision making. And that could mean, let me give you an example for our current project on science of engagement. Some of those here are part of the project, such as Ross and Bethany and others. We are co-developing a measure of co-creation and validating that measure in English and Spanish. Our starting point, starting point with an expert panel member is a national team of 19 partners representing 4 groups. As I mentioned there, we started with a literature review with 5 principles or core functions of co-creation. And after working with our partners, they told us you need 7. And we did. But that has implications for validation, for sample size, for analysis. Our sample size needed to go up. So that means implications for budget, implications for the timeline. So we were able to pull it off. I'm not saying you may always have to do it, but we were able to pull it off and make some changes. And now we're validating the measure with 7 principles instead of 4 or 5. And there are pros and cons on that. But if you are willing and open to all things go with your partners, there are implications for decision making at a higher level. So keep that in mind and be just transparent and honest. Sometimes you might not be able to accommodate. Just report back and say why not. And with some of our colleagues, we have developed tracking tools where you track the recommendations. It's an Excel table, and then you have a kind of a category. Did you adopt the recommendation fully, partial, or no? And then why each. And we use that tracking to ideally know where we are and report back to our partners and learn what are the areas where we are partially or not able to accommodate our partners and why not. So incredibly helpful to track when you are able and your capacity. Number 2, be open to discuss conflict, turnover, loss of interest, availability, those uncomfortable common areas. That's part of the team dynamics, and PCORI's area and capacity might be very helpful. And it is very helpful if from day one you foresee that and you open the group for, it's fine if we disagree, it's fine if we don't see eye to eye from the beginning. Just bring it to the table. I use a graph for our co-creation project, where there is a journey with our partners. Spiro Manso kind of informed that approach. where I presented us in a journey, and lamppost, meaning the pull and push tension of us walking at different paces. We all don't have to walk exactly at the same time. And sometimes we feel the need of walking slowly with our partners, but we have a lamppost that is asking us to move faster to be on that point at certain time. Those are our milestones, our deadlines for our projects. We just brought it up in one of the sessions and acknowledged that tension. That was incredibly helpful to reduce the tension in the room. So that's a concrete example how you can address this from day one. Consider task shifting so your community partners can be trained and perhaps provide training. Consider micro trainings where they receive materials and provide training from you. Again, some colleagues have even used certificates that our partners then can use to have higher income. Colleague has done that in projects in Africa. Keep asking, who are we missing at the table? I strive to always continue to ask that, are we missing someone at the table? And check on your outcomes to make sure that they are meaningful to your partners as well as the communities you care about. Continuing the tour. I'm gonna try to go 10 more minutes so we have a little bit of time, at least 5 minutes for a few questions. Remember my emphasis on we need to know when we are, that question at the beginning, how do we know that we have active engagement? Especially since in my view, researchers might tend to estimate how well we're doing, but our partners might disagree. So I may see our engagement as going phenomenal, all things go, we are collaborating, we are co-creating. Sometimes it happens that if you ask patients or other partners, they might disagree or they might not see it that way. So hence the need to have additional ways of knowing that are not so relying on our own researcher perspective and reporting. Here are 3 validated measures. 1 and 2 are validated that you might find very helpful. Number 1, the REST measure is funded by Picori. It used to be longer. They recently published a 9-item scale that is short. And we are using it for one of the projects, but here's the paper if you're interested. And there are 8 questions. It's a global measure on how are we doing. Is this working? Is this partnership working? You may use this survey on an ongoing basis, midway or toward the end, and use the results more as a learning tool, not to point fingers if you find the scoring surprising or lower than what you expected. So there's a level of responsibility on our end when we evaluate engagement to still use it as an enrichment and as a tool for us to keep learning and walking together in our journey. Again, to avoid pointing fingers or feeling a little hurt. Despite all our efforts, what do you mean patients gave us score of 2? What? I'm here staying on Mondays from 5 to 7 or going to a community center and they still score us so low. That can happen. And hence the commitment to just listen and use these assessment tools as a learning tool to learn more. And tell me about this. How do we do better? What is it working? What is not working? And that has been leading us, in my view, for the past 10, 15 years, especially with advances in community-based participatory research and other fields, including implementation science, D&I dissemination as well, and our emphasis on bringing our partners to help us learn and assess context and align our interventions to context. And I'm very enthusiastic on this promising field by Picori. You may have heard, if not, I will encourage you to take a look. Picori has called it the science of engagement. So in a nutshell, how do we approach engagement as a science? In similar way as we approach other fields. And that means, can we study engagement as a science? And we are doing it. Picori is not only redefining or at least pushing the field forward this way, but also providing significant funding to the science of engagement. The cycles is starting in 2022, I think it's 2022 or 21. They continue. We have 3 teams actually at a course and at university that have been funded by the Science of Engagement, including Bethany, Sarah Brewer with youth. And I lead, our co-lead funding and a project on developing a co-creation tool. So look at that, 36 million. I think now the price tag is even higher. So take a look, go to PCORI, search Science of Engagement. There is robust funding to study engagement. There are 2 categories. One is to develop measures of engagement, and the second one is to actually test different engagement approaches or methods. And again, Bethany is doing an incredible big study in that category. A little bit, I'm not going to dwell on this a lot, but I just wanted to share our study is focusing on co-creation. This is our initial definition. What do you mean by co-creation as a type of engagement? This definition came from the literature, mostly from researchers. So we took this to our expert panel members, which 50% are represented by patients and community members. And the other group is professionals, so researchers are only 25%, 1/4 of that group. So this definition has changed and it's shorter, and we will be publishing soon. But we started defining co-creation, what we mean by co-creation. Definitely, we are building the knowledge and the direction of an area of research or the research process together. And it could be in one of or many of these areas of research and our efforts. And I included some citations if you're interested. Again, my pitch to co-creation is that it could be one of the vehicles that can help us move with our partners more to the right, to all things collaborate and empower as a type of engagement, and to really see the benefits of having a more collaborative role with our partners, but not only on kind of by face validity, but also in terms of the methods we use, the outcomes, and assessing that process. One of the last few points I wanted to make is as we move, some of us, again, you may disagree. I'm not saying advisory boards or only an advisory role for our partners should not happen. Absolutely, and is needed in certain projects, and it's a very important role. I work on the space of all things with partners, and I have learned that to do that, there is a sense of there is a gap, because quite often, especially some underrepresented communities have been often be brought to the table as advisors or to help us with recruitment. And that has been my experience as a study participant many decades ago in North Carolina, and now as a researcher. So there is a level of trust to invite our partners, if we do, to really honor that commitment of collaboration. And if we can, deferring the role to co-investigators for our PCORI project. Our co-investigator is Janice Tufti, who is a patient researcher, and she's a co-investigator and included as a key personnel, for example. So keep that in mind, that there is a level of trust and a gap, a jump that our partners, a leap of faith in a way of trust on moving in that continuum. And I see us with a huge responsibility to really provide something in the middle, so they don't feel that they're jumping to unknown, and they are successful with us on that role. One way of doing that is I often ask, how do you develop trust and engagement if I have 6 months for a pilot or a year? But half of that is with IRB and recruitment. Trust can take years. I don't have the perfect answer. I'm sorry. But one aspect that I have found very helpful is to say, if I don't have a lot of time and for the immediate goal, I do believe that the type of engagement that is all things go on the right side can lead to our partners feeling safe and feeling included and feeling honored. And that can lead to psychological safety If you're not familiar with that term, I will encourage you to take a look. Edmondson has done a lot of research on psychological safety. I'm not afraid to speak up because I don't feel I'm going to be judged or criticized or not heard or not listened to. And that can lead to trust. So I see it more as a process. This could actually go in a recurring loop. But I do think that bringing our partners in that co-creation space, collaborative, can lead to that. Another point to consider, how do we do that, is focus on process. Quite often we focus on the structure of engagement, how many sessions, how big the group, how much to pay them, $25, $50, $80. How do we develop the agenda? Should we provide snacks, which is wonderful, because the type of structure will facilitate a type of engagement. If you meet twice a year, that will be a type of engagement versus if you meet monthly, for example, and you have more of that continuing communication. So a few pointers focus on the process and what that means, decision-making, increasing knowledge and skills on all your partners. Micro trainings could be concrete examples, and how you focus on their ability to actively participate with you as partners. And what is it that you need to do to keep that high quality process throughout the life of your project. Ideally, you continue with that partnership some way, and that's another gap. Once funding is stops, how do we continue with this partnership? So that's another area perhaps for another chat.
You have about 4 minutes, Monica.
Thank you. I think that's it. So I am done. Thank you, Bethany. Some questions for you to keep in mind if you want to share now, or other questions. What has been most challenging for you to engage with partners, and what has worked well? So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. I think that Julie had a question that is exactly related to especially the last few slides that you were talking about. Her question in the chat was, do you have any suggestions for engaging communities in this current climate where they may not feel safe participating in research?
Yeah. So I wish I could, and this question has been posed to many of us, including those who may represent or work with minoritized communities. I don't have the perfect answer. Let me tell you what I'm doing. And again, it's not perfect. I keep doing my work. I am mindful that there are changes that may not align with our values and work for many reasons. I think some of this is how do you approach it? Let me give you an example. I have a project funded, at least as of today, by AHRQ. And even when we submitted the proposal, that was in last year, 2022, we focused a lot on the values of AHRQ and their framework on whole person care and family centeredness. To me, that's equity. And to me, that's disparities. I did not include the words equity and disparities because I was focusing on their how they approach it and the wording and how make it real and concrete. And so far the project has been okay. So again, I'm not saying you need to say something and do something else. I'm just giving you an example on how you can continue to do your research and your work. If in fact it's in the space of family centeredness and health for all. I think Amy, a colleague, mentioned that we have been talking about health for all for decades, but continue doing your work. And we have been very innovative and finding ways to, if we have to identify different sources of funding, consider PCORI. PCORI is not NIH. They have funding until 2029. They have not been impacted, and they are happy and welcome to address equity, inclusion, and other fields that might be challenging now in other areas. So that's another suggestion. Foundations, Robert Wood Johnson, William T. Grant have stepped up, and they are providing funding for big centers on health equity and equity. So those are $2-3 million grants. So they're becoming now powerful partners for us to continue moving forward. And again, I don't have all the answers.
Can I ask a
acknowledge.
follow-up question, Monica, about that?
Yeah.
Have you had conversations with, I know you work with lots of different communities in your projects, and have you had conversations with the partners and community members that are included in your projects? I'm just thinking about like the psychological safety piece and then the trust, the ongoing trust and relationships that you build. So, I think everyone has thoughts about, I've read lots of interesting things about ways to write about things in grant applications and Health for All. Like Demetria was here yesterday talking some about, all of this research is relevant to Health for All. And making America healthy again, like all of this is relevant to that. Is like in some cases it might be a matter of framing it or terminology, but when you're thinking of the actual people who are involved in your projects, I'm curious if you've had a chance yet to think about what you are saying and how you're working with them right now.
Yes, let me share some comments from Spanish-speaking colleagues and experts with in our projects that are community members and caregivers. One mentioned good luck on engaging Spanish speakers in research. So somber but real, and I acknowledge that comment, and I do have to think about that because it is real. Some suggestions. So for PCORI, we are struggling with recruitment of Spanish-speaking partners, and I think it's nationwide even more. Some suggestions our partners have given us is some public spaces are no longer feeling safe, including recreational centers. Some projects I'm part of are having a hard time. Families don't want to leave their homes. So suggestions have been recruit and do data and interviews inside clinics, like at the end of an appointment. So they don't have to leave and meet you somewhere else. But if they're already there at an appointment, can you do data collection or interviews, for example, there? More Zoom meetings. We do Zoom meetings with our caregivers so they don't have to drive and travel, in part because some moms have kiddos, small children. So that was another suggestion. What about that? Do it remotely with caregivers and members of the community. Another one is, can you meet at someone's home in their neighborhood that feels safer, someone who is a leader, and that person can invite their comadre or their friends in their community to meet there and do, like, remember in this country there are Tupperware parties? It reminds me of that. Or Mary Kay makeup, where you go and you cannot share things, but it's someone home and you are very welcoming, and there might be snacks. That was a suggestion from a Spanish-speaking community partner, which I thought it was incredibly helpful. So we are listening and we are thinking of all those strategies, but there is a loss, and I do agree that loss of sense of trust and safety in general.
Yeah, thank you so much, Monica. I think that's really important. I think it's, as people have ideas and the communities and individuals that we work with make suggestions about what might make it more possible for them to continue participating in projects and partnering with us, or just providing data as participants, depending on kind of their role in the project. I think like sharing this is going to be really important going forward. So I know you do so much of this work, so I really appreciate you sharing that with us. And thank you so much for your session today. It was fantastic, all the resources. I'm going to just lead our wrap up for day 2. So for those of you who are just coming to the sessions, we're almost done. I'm going to share some resources and some logistical kind of end of the day information with everyone. And then I'll talk about what's happening with our small group participants this afternoon. I did want to respond really quickly to the last comment/question that was in the chat from Kath about, like, does this workshop imply the essential competencies in implementation science research that people should be thinking about pursuing if you're, developing a career and want to develop that expertise in implementation science? And then also, how do we evaluate the impact of our workshop? So the answer to number 1 is, so Bethany shared, I'm going to click putting this in here. Bethany shared an article from 2022 that that Amy Hubschman was the lead author on. And a lot of the people who teach in our certificate program, both who are from CU, but other institutions like WashU, were part of this project where it was an updating of competencies. And so this started with an older study that that was surveying and connecting with any kind of implementation science or D&I research training program across the country. So there are, as you know, there are short workshops, there are kind of longer 1-week workshops, there are graduate level courses, there are things that you can register for and go to for a week. There's a ton of things available, and they all kind of differ in intensity. So first they were looking for what are those core concepts or competencies that are covered across all of them, and then what need do we see as implementation research continues to develop. So the article that I just put in the chat is a great one to look at, and in table 6 there is a list of all of the competencies kind of organized under type of competency. And so as far as this workshop goes, we base this on our intro to D&I research and health class, which is the broadest. It's kind of a scope of as much of D&I research as we can fit into one semester based class. We teach that in our certificate program. It's a required initial class for every cohort that comes in. And then subsequent classes, like I mentioned yesterday, we could spend more than a day on Monica's topic, for example, and Jody's topic of study design today, and Russ's topic of assessing outcomes. So this is really meant to be this kind of overview, the same way that our D&I course is. And it is that course is mapped onto competencies. So I cannot tell you that they are all addressed today, but they a lot of them are addressed today. And then I would suggest going and pulling that article, looking at table 6, if what you really want to see is what else you want to focus future training or learnings on. So with regard to the question about how we assess the impact of the workshop, so this is the second time we've had the workshop. Jordan, who is on, I can see him right now, is both with our certificate program and with education and the teams program in Accords that works on training and education. So he will be heading up our evaluations as he did last year. We try to improve every year based on the feedback we get. I'm going to let him talk about evaluations quickly, and then I'm going to run through just the resources for you all and then set you either free or give you a break before the afternoon groups.
Hello, I am Jordan. I've been in your inbox and calendar for a lot of things, but as Tina was saying, I head up our evaluations. So this second time doing this, we really do pay attention to everything that you put into that evaluation and how we can develop. While this is only our second time doing this workshop, I think it's my 9th workshop I've hosted at Accords. So we do listen to what you put into there. So I would appreciate if you take a moment to do that. I also want to let you all know that the recordings from all the didactic sessions and the resources and materials are going to be put onto a Canvas shell. So you will have access to those for a short period of time following this workshop. All to say, expect even a few more emails from me over the next week or so. And also with that evaluation, you can claim a certificate of completion. So we'll get that sent out to you via PDF just to say that you participated. And any questions, you can certainly send me an email to my personal email or the accords.education@cuandshoots.edu email as well. So we appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Jordan's amazing. You can see, some of us can't share our slides effectively. That would include me. So without Jordan, we wouldn't be having a workshop because nobody would know how to do it. I think I'm sharing. I don't know. I can't see it all lit up. Am I sharing? Okay, good. There was something that you just said that I know what I was gonna say. So last year, this whole chat thing, which has been mentioned by multiple of the presenters, we're really used to using chat as like this separate conversation all the way through everything that we do. So we use it heavily in classes, in many of our trainings and lots of our webinars and meetings that our core holds. And we really were trying not to do that this year because we got lots and lots of feedback last year that the information overload from the talk that was happening and any discussion that was happening during that talk, and then trying to follow that chat at the same time was really hard for people. And so we were very intentionally trying not to do that this time. Hopefully we cut back on it enough. The flip of that, though, is that that kind of limits the Q&A opportunities, because we often use that as as somebody's talking, to answer in real time people's questions that are popping up. So this is kind of a pilot of trying to pull all the questions out, answer what we could if people had time at the end of their sessions, and then start answering some of them during the break in the chat and at lunch during the chat. However, a few people have mentioned that they left the meeting and then they can't see the chat anymore. They lose the earlier part of the chat. So because these are being recorded, we do have the chats. We should have the chat transcripts saved in Zoom, and we're not going to share those, but I'll get together with Jordan after this and see. We wanted to have something like a Q&A document that we also share in that Canvas website. So we'll try to do that. For when I've been here, I've been keeping track of questions, and others have done the same thing, just to make sure we don't miss anything. And we will do our best to get that up fairly quickly. And thank you for the patience with, asking a question that doesn't seem to be being answered. We're trying to get to them in a way that doesn't distract people as we go through the other information that's being shared. Okay, so let me give you the wrap up for today. We're hoping you're taking away from this that there's lots of different research designs in D&I that you can use. Some of them are really familiar, look like all research, but some are really innovative. Those hybrid effectiveness implementation studies are amazing because they give us a chance to simultaneously look at both types of outcomes, whether one is exploratory and the other is primary, or whether they are both the main focus of the project. They're intended to really speed up that timeline, that drag that we have of translating research into practice. Adaptations happen whether you're planning an adaptation or not. And so just be aware of that. It takes a special flexible soul to do this kind of research, because things are not as controlled as they are in lots of other types of studies, and you can learn from that. And so all this information about planning, but also tracking and learning from adaptations, is important. As Russ covered, we have lots of approaches to assessment. Mixed methods are really important. Our Accords Center has a mixed methods, qualitative and mixed methods core, that offers resources online. And if you're here at CU Anschutz, they do consultations as well and can be really helpful. And then this whole idea that Monica talked about meaningful, genuine, and ongoing engagement with multiple types of partners is really an underlying principle of D&I science. So I'm going to fly through these because we're supposed to be done and I'm always running over. This is a list of recommended textbooks. You'll have it in your slides. This is the one by Pierre Nelson that was mentioned a couple of times. This is the one that Russ showed during his presentation that is a really accessible D&I text. It's wonderful. This is kind of the primary text. This is the 3rd edition now. It's very, very dense. And so if you're kind of looking to step into D&I, this one over here by Brian and Kara and Kenneth Schur is probably a great one to start with. This slide you can look at if you're not familiar with D&I publications. There are lots and lots of journals that are publishing this stuff now. Some of them are topic specific, some are implementation science journals. So this is just a selection of them. It's helpful to look through their titles and see what kind of stuff they're publishing and what you can learn. These are different centers and consortiums that offer information on trainings, short courses, webinars, lots of great info. No, they're not clickable, Julie. They're just on there. So you can see what they are. They're all available through multiple online booksellers, none of whom I will mention, but you can find them. And then the TIDERC is an open access. It's still available. It's on NCI's website. This is based on their original week-long training that they used to do in D&I research. They kind of shifted it to be cancer specific. And then when the in-person training ended, they put the entire curriculum online. So if you're looking for a self-study way of getting a lot of D&I information, I highly recommend the TIDERC open access training. Everything is cancer related, but everything goes across all fields. So just insert your field instead of cancer as you're listening to talks. The IRI and the high IRI, these are things at WashU that are really helpful intensive trainings. These are the grants. They still exist. The FOAs are out. These are the updated links. PCORI that Monica talked about quite a bit, and then some sample D&I grants, which can be helpful. Every year there is an annual conference on the science of D&I science and health. It's an awesome conference. It's a great, like, people are so friendly at this conference. Every topic is covered. So if you have the opportunity to travel, it's generally like the second week of December. The new information isn't up, but the info from last year's conference is up right now. And then CIRC is the Society for Implementation Research Collaboration. They do a conference every 2 years. Last time it was in Denver. I cannot remember where it is next year, but it is a great organization that supports implementation research. This is the this is probably not updated actually, but this exists. This is the implementation science website at the NCI. Lots of things are on here: webinars, blogs, sample grants, research tools, recommendations for training. DISC, this is where Borsika is, and she is one of the leaders of the DISC program, Dissemination and Implementation Science Center at UC San Diego. Highly recommend. They have lots of online resources. The Adaptation, Fidelity, and Tailoring Work Group is kind of a collaboration between them and others. And so you can find out more about it on their website. There you have some specific resources you can use the PDFs to get to, but lots of like tools and readings. Similarly, Accords, our Dissemination and Implementation Science program, you may have already been on here because maybe that's how you learned about the workshop, but we also have lots of resources and services, information about what we do, and lots of tools and interactive guides available. This is the Colorado Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute, so our CTSA, called the CCTSI, and Bethany is a cross member of both the Accords D&I team and the CCTSI team. So she leads the Dissemination and Implementation Research Core at the CCTSI. They have a very strong focus on dissemination and so many amazing resources. So like if you're writing a dissemination plan for a grant, for example, I would go to their website and find examples of all of the different ways that you can disseminate beyond our traditional kind of academic articles and articles and presentations. It's a fantastic website with lots of resources, including this dissemination inspiration library, which is awesome. This is a clickable list of all of the shared resources that have been co-developed across our program at Accords and the CCTSI core. And so please check these out if you haven't already during the talk. These are some really highly recommended resources that we offer. Our certificate program, which we've mentioned multiple times, we take applications January 15th to February 15th every year to start the following fall. And we usually have cohorts between 12 and 14 students coming in each fall. It's completely online and live. So you're basically in small classes led by the faculty who are doing lots of these presentations in a 12 credit program that addresses all of the recommended D&I competencies and research and helps people develop their proposals. It's all very kind of practical and applied. So I wanted to make sure you knew about that. And then coming up June 4th and 5th, I don't know what number CopperCon this is. It might be like the 5th or 6th CopperCon.
Six.
Yeah. Awesome. So this is the Colorado Pragmatic Research and Health Conference. You can register online for it, and it crosses over with D&I. There's just such a huge overlap between pragmatic research and D&I because most D&I research is very pragmatic. So this will have lots of featured speakers and opportunities to learn methods and learn about research that's going on that's pragmatic, and tools that you can use to improve your own pragmatic research. And that's it for the resources. So for those staying for small groups, we're going to take a break until 11:15. I have cut into your lunch, but come back. That's wrong. 1:15. Oh yeah, sorry. Come back at 1:15. We probably did not update that time. Come back at 1:15. We'll do the small group intensives. Jordan will put you back in your rooms. For those of you who are not doing the small groups, thank you so much for coming. It's a ton of information. We know it's kind of like a fire hose. But I hope that you can go back and access Canvas and the things that Jordan has already emailed to you, look up things that you want to follow up on. Feel free to contact us if you have questions, and we will be offering more workshops in the future. And since you were here, you'll definitely be on the distribution list to learn about them first. So thanks for your time and attention, and it was great to share all this with you. Have a good lunch and/or a good Thursday.